Here at Corny Tales, we dive deep into the wildest stories, where loyalty is tested, secrets unravel, and justice takes unexpected turns. If you love stories that keep you on edge, ones that make you gasp, think, and crave more, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share, because some tales are just too good to keep to yourself. Welcome to Corny Tales, where the unexpected is just the beginning. Just beneath the surface, Shaun Jordan sat at the poker table, his expression neutral as he studied his cards. The weekly neighborhood game provided the perfect cover for his observations. Around him, 4 other men focused intently on their hands, chips stacked neatly before them. But Shaun's attention wasn't on the game. His wife Tiffany's footsteps echoed from upstairs, followed by the familiar sound of the bathroom door closing. Her third trip in the past hour. Shaun noted the time, 9:47 p.m. The pattern was becoming clear. "Raise you 50, Mark Stevens announced, pushing forward a stack of chips. Shaun matched the bet without hesitation, his mind calculating a different set of probabilities. Through years of MI6 training, he'd learned to compartmentalize, to appear engaged while his senses remained alert to his surroundings. Poker had never really been about the money for him. It was an exercise in observation, a test of how well a man could mask his true thoughts. Right now, he was more interested in the rhythm of the evening, the disruptions in his carefully structured world. The buzz of Tiffany's phone vibrated through the ceiling, a sound that would have been imperceptible to most. But Shaun noticed. He always noticed. He trained himself to pick up on the slightest disturbances, the smallest inconsistencies. "You're quiet tonight, Shaun," Dave Peterson remarked, taking a sip of his beer. "Usually by now you're telling us about your latest security consultation, horror stories." Shaun offered a measured smile. "Just focused on the game." Mark chuckled. "That's a first. Usually you're robbing us blind by now." "Speaking of horror stories, how's that new alarm system working out?" Dave leaned back, stretching his arms. Shaun tapped his chips idly, listening. Upstairs, the bathroom door opened again. A soft creak, light footsteps padded down the hallway. Then the hushed murmur of Tiffany's voice. She was speaking to someone, but the words were too faint to make out. He didn't need to hear them to understand what was happening. Her voice carried an urgency that he'd grown increasingly familiar with over the past few months. She was being careful. Careful not to be overheard. Careful not to make mistakes. But she underestimated her audience. The game continued for another hour, but Shaun had already won in a different way. He'd gathered new information, new data, to add to his growing mental file. The poker match, the friendly banter, the casual routine, it was all just a cover, a way to maintain the illusion. At 11:06 p.m., as his guest departed, Shaun walked him to the door, shaking hands, sharing jokes. But his eyes flicked past them, scanning the street with an ease that seemed almost instinctual. A dark sedan was parked 2 houses down. The car hadn't been there during previous poker nights. It sat there, silent, unmarked. No interior light, no visible occupant. But Shaun knew someone was inside, watching. He closed the door behind him and turned to find Tiffany descending the stairs. "Great game, everyone," she called out, with the effortless charm of a woman who had perfected the art of being liked. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of a yoga instructor, a tone meant to disarm, to soothe. She was dressed in yoga pants and a studio-branded top, her blonde hair pulled back into a perfect ponytail, not a single strand out of place despite her supposed repeated trips to the bathroom. John bent down to gather the empty bottles and poker chips, his movements deliberate, methodical. "How's the studio doing, honey?" he asked casually, his tone betraying nothing. "You mentioned something about new workshops." Tiffany beamed, stepping lightly onto the last stair. "Amazing. The response has been incredible." Her enthusiasm was convincing, but not to him. Shaun detected the slight pitch change in her voice, a tell he had identified long before she ever realized she had one. "Matthew and I are expanding the class schedule," she continued. The demand is incredible. Matthew Robertson. Shaun had run a background check on Tiffany's business partner months ago, back when his instincts had first flickered with doubt. Old money, impressive education, charming personality, and several flags that wouldn't show up in a standard search. Shaun had learned that Matthew had a history of calculated moves, silent business partnerships that ended abruptly, financial records that didn't quite add up, and a personal life that seemed too carefully curated, the kind of man who wasn't reckless, but who wasn't afraid of risk. "That's great, great," Shaun responded, keeping his tone light, his posture relaxed. Tiffany smiled again, but it was just a fraction too wide, a smile meant to reassure, to distract. "You've been putting in a lot of extra hours lately," Shaun added, watching. Tiffany's fingers twitched toward her phone. A subconscious reaction, another tell. Shaun placed a hand on the back of one of the kitchen chairs and leaned forward slightly. "Actually, I was thinking of dropping by the studio sometime, see what all the hype is about." Tiffany hesitated. A flash of something passed through her eyes, something quick, fleeting. Then she laughed, the sound light and airy. "You, in a yoga class?" "Ah!" John smirked. "Stranger things have happened." She shook her head, playfully dismissing the idea. "I don't think you'd survive 5 minutes." Shaun chuckled along with her, but inside the pieces were clicking into place. She was trying to steer him away, that much was clear. Outside, the dark sedan remained parked 2 houses down. And inside, Tiffany Jordan was playing a dangerous game she didn't realize she'd already lost. Shaun studied Tiffany's expression as she spoke, her tone light and casual, yet something about it felt too rehearsed. "Well, success requires sacrifice. You understand that, Mr. Security Consultant?" The irony wasn't lost on Shaun. His cover as a security consultant provided the perfect explanation for his irregular hours and occasional bruises. If Tiffany suspected his true occupation, she showed no sign of it. "Speaking of work," she continued, stirring her tea absently, "I have an early morning meeting tomorrow. Some potential investors are interested in franchising opportunities." Shaun nodded, noting how she avoided specifying the time or location. He leaned back in his chair, watching for any subtle tells. "Don't forget we have dinner with your parents this weekend." A flash of something... annoyance? Worry? Crossed Tiffany's face before her yoga instructor's smile returned. "Of course not. Mom's been texting me all week about it." Later that night, Shaun lay awake, listening to Tiffany's measured breathing beside him. His phone buzzed, a message from his MI6 handler, Garrett. "Unusual chatter in local channels. Maintain operational security. Check in tomorrow." Shaun deleted the message, his jaw tightening. The timing wasn't coincidental. Something was brewing, and his years of experience told him personal and professional threats were about to intersect. The next morning, Shaun maintained his routine, up at 5 a.m., coffee brewing by 5:15. He watched through the kitchen window as the same dark sedan from the previous night drove past their house. Too slow to be a regular commuter. His phone rang. Nate Little. His friend from his police days, now a private investigator. Nate had become an invaluable source of street-level intelligence. "Shaun, got something you need to hear." Nate's voice was low, urgent. "Remember those properties we discussed? Found a connection. The buyer's been using shell companies, but the patterns matched those locations your wife mentioned for her workshops." Shaun's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "Send me everything you have." "Already did. Encrypted file. Usual protocol." "Shaun, be careful. These aren't small-time players." The conversation ended as Tiffany entered the kitchen, dressed for her morning class. She grabbed a protein smoothie from the fridge, avoiding Shaun's eyes. "Don't wait up tonight," she said, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "Emergency studio meeting. Some issues with the new location permits." "Need any help? I know some people in the zoning office." "No." The response came too quickly. Tiffany softened her tone. "I mean, no thank you. Matthew's handling it. He has connections. Shaun watched her leave, noting how she checked her mirrors before pulling out of the driveway. Amateur surveillance detection, but telling nonetheless. His sister Amanda's unexpected visit that afternoon added another layer of complexity. A respected psychologist, she possessed the same analytical mind that had made Shaun an excellent detective. "You've lost weight," she observed, studying him over lunch at his favorite diner. "And don't tell me it's from working out more. I know stress when I see it." A habit from his early MI6 days. "Just busy with work, new clients, bigger projects." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "Funny, that's exactly what Tiffany said when I ran into her last week at that new hotel downtown, the Peninsula. She mentioned she was there for a yoga workshop, but her outfit seemed more business casual than yoga appropriate." Shaun filed away the information, maintaining his composure. "The studio's expanding, lots of meetings." Amanda's voice dropped. "As your sister and a mental health professional, I need you to know, I'm here if you need to talk about anything." That night, Shaun pored over the files Nate had sent. His encrypted laptop screen glowed in the dimly lit study, casting long shadows across the room. The addresses matched locations Tiffany had casually mentioned over the past few months. He cross-referenced them with offshore accounts flagged in MI6 databases. The results sent a cold wave through him. Shell companies tied to entities known for laundering money. Names he recognized from past operations. A pattern was emerging, and Tiffany was at the center of it. His instinct screamed at him to confront her, but he held back. He needed more proof. The next day, Shaun followed Tiffany after she left for her supposed emergency meeting. Keeping a safe distance, he watched as she drove across town and pulled into a high-accent restaurant parking lot. A few minutes later, Matthew Roberson arrived. Shaun stayed in his car, lowering his sunglasses as he observed their interaction. The body language between them wasn't professional. Leaning in too closely, a hand brushing an arm, the way Tiffany's laughter came a little too easily. Anger flared in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. This was bigger than an affair. He needed to know the full extent of her involvement. He waited until they both entered the restaurant, then slid out of his car. Moving with practiced ease, he entered through a side door, careful to stay out of sight. The restaurant was busy, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. He spotted Tiffany and Matthew at a corner booth, heads close together. Activating the discreet listening device embedded in his watch, he tuned into their conversation. "We need to move faster," Matthew was saying. "There's too much risk if we delay now," Tiffany responded, her voice hushed. "But Shaun's been asking questions. He's too observant. We can't afford mistakes." Matthew exhaled sharply. "Then maybe it's time to deal with that problem permanently." Shaun's breath stilled. The pieces clicked into place. Tiffany wasn't just involved. She was orchestrating something dangerous, and now they were planning to eliminate him. He slipped out of the restaurant before they could notice him. His pulse pounded, but his mind remained cold and focused. They thought they were hunting him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That evening, while reviewing Nate's files, Shaun heard Max, their golden retriever, growling at the front door. Unusual behavior for the normally friendly dog. It was late, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tapping of keys on his laptop. Shaun's eyes shifted to the living room as the growls deepened, a low rumble that sent a chill up his spine. Max, who had always greeted everyone with wagging enthusiasm, was now snarling, ears pinned back in a way Shaun had never seen before. Something about the dog's sudden aggression felt unsettling, almost unnatural. Shaun was about to get up when he heard footsteps behind him. Tiffany entered, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, the faint perfume of lavender mixing with the smell of the night air. Max's growls intensified at the sound of her voice. "What's gotten into him?" Tiffany asked, glancing at Shaun, then at the dog, who had his eyes fixed on her with a fierce, unwavering stare. Max barked sharply, his body stiff as though guarding the space between them. Shaun watched the exchange, noting Tiffany's hesitation as she cautiously stepped back toward the door. There was no mistaking the unease in her eyes, a flicker of discomfort that she quickly masked with a forced smile. "I don't know," Shaun said, his voice steady but probing. "He's been acting strange lately, like he doesn't trust you." Tiffany chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to her laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. He probably smells the other dogs from the studio. You know how dogs are." Shaun's gaze never left her. Over the past few months, Max's behavior had become more erratic, more distant toward Tiffany. The changes had coincided with her increasing absences, the late nights she spent working or attending social events. He had noticed the small shifts, the subtle tension in Tiffany's smile, the way her eyes darted around when she thought no one was looking. But it was the dog's reaction that unsettled him most. "You think?" Shaun asked, though he already knew the answer. There was something more to it, something deeper than just the scent of other animals. Tiffany's eyes flickered for a moment, betraying a vulnerability she was quick to suppress. "Yes," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "Anyway, I'm exhausted. I'll be in bed soon." Shaun didn't respond, watching as she retreated up the stairs. He couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's behavior was just one small piece of the puzzle. Something was off, and he was getting closer to uncovering it. Later that week, the community charity event provided Shaun with another opportunity to observe Tiffany from a distance. She had insisted on attending, claiming it was important for her to network with local business owners. It didn't take long for Shaun to realize that her networking was more about talking to certain people in dark corners of the room than about charity work. He could see the way her smile softened for some of the men, the way she exchanged whispered words with people whose names she had barely mentioned in passing. He positioned himself near the silent auction tables, ostensibly examining the items on display, but his mind was elsewhere, on Tiffany and her strange behavior. From across the room, he saw her laughing, a little too loudly, a little too freely. She was always charming, always able to draw attention. But tonight, there was something else in her eyes. As he observed, he heard her voice, low and hushed, as she spoke into her phone. "We need to accelerate the timeline," she said, her words barely audible over the chatter around her. "Shaun's becoming suspicious." Shaun's heart raced. The mention of him, suspicious, made his blood run cold. He hadn't been wrong. His instincts were sharper than he had given himself credit for. He took a step closer, pretending to adjust the tie around his neck, and listened in. "No, I can handle him. Just make sure everything's in place." Tiffany's voice continued, colder now, more detached. Shaun stood still for a moment, processing the words. They didn't make sense at first. Everything in his life with Tiffany had been about control, about stability, but now it felt as though that foundation was crumbling beneath him, bit by bit. His mind raced. What timeline? What was she talking about? Who was she speaking to? His grip tightened around the edge of the table as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, aligning in ways that made his stomach churn. Before he could process any further, Tiffany's gaze caught his, and her smile appeared on cue, bright and practiced. "Honey," she exclaimed, her voice too cheerful, too perfect. "See anything worth bidding on?" She glided toward him, all grace and elegance, her posture poised. Shaun forced a smile, masking the suspicion that gnawed at him. "Just keeping my options open," he said, the double meaning clear to him alone. "You seem stressed. Everything okay?" Tiffany's expression hardened for a moment before she quickly composed herself. Her lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. You're being paranoid again. This is exactly why I need space to breathe, Shaun. Your constant hovering, your questions, your need to control everything." Shaun felt the weight of her words, the accusation that his concern was unwarranted, that he was the problem. It was the same tactic she had used before, designed to put him on the defensive, to make him question himself. He recognized it instantly. It was a technique he had often used in interrogations. But this time, it didn't feel like a game. "I'm just concerned," Shaun said, his voice calm but firm. "You've been distant lately." Tiffany's face reddened, and her voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "Maybe because you won't give me room to grow," she shot back, her words sharp and cutting. "I'm trying to build something here, Shaun. The studio is my chance to be more than just your wife." The words stung. He had heard them before, but this time they felt different. Tiffany wasn't just defending herself, she was pushing him away, carving out a space that didn't include him. Her ambition, her desire for independence, it was all coming to a head, and Shaun was no longer certain where he stood in her life. The tension between them was palpable, but before it could escalate further, Tiffany smiled once again, flashing her perfect teeth. "I'll be right back," she said sweetly, before turning on her heel and walking away, her figure slipping into the crowd. Shaun stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. Something was happening, something he couldn't quite grasp. But he knew one thing for certain. The woman he had married was hiding something, and he was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. The performance at the charity event had been convincing. Shaun watched as several guests shot him disapproving looks, already casting him as the controlling husband, the one who couldn't bear to let his wife have a life of her own. Their judgmental glances were like daggers, but he maintained his composure, offering nothing but a well-timed smile when the eyes of the room met his. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had fallen into an eerie stillness, Shaun sat in his office, the glow of his laptop illuminating the dark room. He reviewed the surveillance footage again, each frame reinforcing the suspicions that had been gnawing at him for months. His fingers drummed silently on the desk as he watched Tiffany in the garden, her movements deliberate, cautious. The footage had captured her making several calls, always checking for witnesses first. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Shaun's trained eyes, it was as clear as day. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Tiffany's behavior, the odd absences, her evasiveness. It all pointed to something Shaun had hoped wasn't true, but now had no choice but to accept. His breath caught in his throat as the truth became undeniable. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from Garrett. "Meeting tomorrow, 800, usual place. Critical information regarding local security concerns." Shaun didn't hesitate. He sent a brief acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less, and then returned to the footage. On screen, Tiffany paced the garden, her conversation becoming heated. "I don't care what it takes," she said, her voice low but fierce. "He's becoming a problem, and problems need to be solved." The threat in her words was clear, though masked in the guise of a casual conversation. The implied danger would have chilled a lesser man. But Shaun Jordan wasn't a lesser man. He wasn't just a husband. He was a former MI6 operative, trained to face situations far darker than a cheating wife and her ambitious lover. As he switched off the monitor, Shaun's expression remained neutral, but his eyes, cold, calculating, betrayed the storm raging within him. The game was escalating, and Shaun was done playing defense. It was time to remind everyone why he had been one of MI6's most effective operatives. The thought brought a cold smile to his lips. Tiffany and Matthew were about to learn that betraying a trained operative carried consequences far beyond their worst nightmares. The following morning, Shaun settled into his office, a quiet sanctuary where the weight of his thoughts could be processed. His encrypted laptop hummed softly, the surveillance program tracking Tiffany's movements with methodical precision. The feeds displayed her entry into the yoga studio for her usual afternoon class, a mundane detail, but one that added another piece to the growing puzzle. 30 minutes later, Shaun's eyes narrowed as a familiar Mercedes pulled into the back lot. The man who stepped out, Matthew Robertson, adjusted his designer suit with a practiced, self-assured gesture. He was the picture of sophistication, though Shaun could see the rot beneath the surface. Matthew was everything Shaun despised, arrogant and deceitful, a man who would use anyone, including Tiffany, to climb the social ladder. Matthew entered through the service entrance of the studio, and Shaun's computer pinged. Target B, flight details confirmed, Dallas, Houston, Miami. The pattern was undeniable. Tiffany's recent trips to various cities now made sense. It was all part of a larger plan, one that Shaun hadn't been able to piece together until now. His phone buzzed again, breaking his concentration. Another message from Garrett. Meeting at 800. Critical information. Shaun sent a brief acknowledgement and then leaned back in his chair, his mind already working on the next steps. He had a meeting to attend, but there was no way he could focus until the wheels of his own investigation were set in motion. The knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Comin'. Garrett Hutchinson entered, his usual confident stride betraying the concern he tried to hide. His MI6 credentials were visible for a brief moment before he tucked them away with a deliberate motion. Your training session with the new recruit starts in 30, but first, we need to discuss something, Garrett said, his tone pragmatic. Shaun minimized his surveillance feeds, his eyes cold as he met Garrett's gaze. What's on your mind? You've been distracted, Garrett said, his voice blunt. The recruits haven't noticed, but I have. Your last 3 reports included details about local real estate holdings that have nothing to do with our current operations. Shaun's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Background research, he replied smoothly, masking his thoughts. Some interesting patterns in property acquisitions by my wife's business partner. Garrett raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Shaun, I've known you long enough to know when something's off. Whatever's happening, don't let it compromise our work. Shaun's expression remained neutral, but his voice dropped, hardening with authority. Have I ever compromised an operation? No, Garrett conceded, though his gaze lingered on Shaun a moment longer than necessary. That's why I'm here as a friend, not your handler. Just be careful. Personal vendettas have a way of clouding judgment. Shaun's gaze was icy, but he appreciated Garrett's concern. It was rare to find a friend in the intelligence world, especially one who would speak so frankly. Still, his mind was already elsewhere, planning the next move in his silent war against Tiffany and Matthew. The training session with the recruits provided a much-needed outlet for his growing tension. The physical exertion, the brutal combat techniques, Shaun drove them hard, pushing them to their limits. He didn't hold back. His controlled brutality left several of them nursing bruises. But it was the lesson they needed. You're not fighting fair fights, he barked as he helped a recruit up after a particularly harsh takedown. Your opponents won't announce their intentions. They won't follow rules. Neither should you. By the end of the session, Shaun's mind was clearer, but the weight of his personal mission still pressed down on him. He couldn't afford to lose focus. As he walked to his car, a voice called out to him. It was Joan Kelly, his neighbor from 3 doors down. Her expression was troubled, her body language uneasy. Shaun, I've been meaning to talk to you, she said, glancing around to ensure privacy. It's about Tiffany. And that business partner of hers? Shaun's interest sharpened, though his face betrayed nothing. Oh? John hesitated before continuing, wringing her hands. Several of us have noticed things during studio events, the way they interact. Linda saw them at Riverside Park last week. They seemed very familiar with each other. Familiar how? Shaun asked, his voice steady but sharp. The kind of familiar that married people shouldn't be with someone who isn't their spouse. Joan met his gaze, her eyes full of concern. We didn't want to say anything, but after what happened at the charity event, her voice trailed off. But Shaun's mind was already shifting into action. The pieces were falling into place, and everything he'd suspected was becoming clear. He nodded, offering a reassuring smile. I appreciate You telling me, Joan? But inside, he was already planning the endgame. It was time to take control. Tiffany and Matthew had made a grave mistake, and now Shaun Jordan was coming for them. Shaun played his role perfectly, wearing confusion and concern like a well-tailored suit. His face mirrored the exact amount of bewilderment and concern one would expect from a husband learning of troubling whispers about his wife's business. I appreciate you telling me, Joan. Tiffany's been under a lot of stress with the studio expansion, he said, the words slipping off his tongue with practiced ease. Joan, visibly relieved that he wasn't lashing out, continued, her voice lowering as if revealing a great secret. That's not all. My Henry works at First National. He says the studio's finances aren't looking good. There's talk about irregular transfers, missing funds. The information hit Shaun like a bullet, clean, precise, and undeniable. Matthew's influence was clearly deeper than just a romantic entanglement. The studio's financial instability was exactly the type of leverage someone like Matthew would exploit. The pieces were falling into place, but Shaun wasn't ready to make any rash moves just yet. Not until he had everything. That evening, just as the shadows grew long and the house settled into the comforting hum of normalcy, an encrypted email pinged on Shaun's laptop. It was from an unexpected source, Geneva Best, Matthew's ex-wife. Mr. Jordan, I know what they're doing. I've seen it before. Matthew has a pattern. Find successful women, charm them, then use their resources and connections for his schemes. Check the attached documents and watch your back. Shaun's pulse quickened as he opened the attachments. The documents were filled with damning information. Failed businesses, questionable transactions, and a clear pattern of manipulation. Matthew's strategy was disturbingly effective. Establish trust, create financial dependency, then exploit until there was nothing left. It was a classic con. Geneva's warning was chilling, but it only steeled Shaun's resolve. The man was dangerous, and Tiffany had fallen into his trap. As Shaun absorbed the gravity of the situation, the sound of the front door opening broke his concentration. Tiffany stepped into his office, dressed in theater clothes rather than her usual yoga attire. She looked different, lighter, more carefree, as if the weight of her secret life were far from her mind. I've joined the community theater group, she announced brightly. We're doing Death of a Salesman. The director says I have natural talent. Shaun blinked in surprise, hiding his rising suspicion behind a mask of casual interest. That's new, he observed, carefully studying her. I thought you were focused on the studio expansion. Tiffany shrugged, her voice defensive. I need something for myself, Shan. A creative outlet, she said, her words sharp, as if preparing for a confrontation. Unless you have a problem with that too? No problem, Shaun said with a tight smile. Break a leg. He watched her leave, his mind racing. Her sudden, theatrical ambitions were too well timed. They conveniently filled in the gaps in his surveillance schedule, offering her the perfect cover to meet Matthew or handle business affairs without his watchful eyes. Everything she did now felt like a well-calculated move in a game he hadn't agreed to play, but had no choice but to win. The next morning, during his annual physical, Dr. Dennis Johnston frowned at Shaun's test results. The numbers weren't right. His blood pressure was elevated, and the stress levels were through the roof. Whatever is going on, Shaun, you need to address it before it becomes serious, Dr. Johnston warned, his face drawn with concern. Shaun deflected, offering a half-hearted excuse. Just work pressure, he said, though his mind was already calculating how to use this information. The doctor was right, of course. His body had begun to show the strain of the last few months, but he wasn't going to let that derail him. Not now. I'm recommending counseling, Dr. Johnston continued, oblivious to Shaun's internal calculations. Perhaps couples therapy. Many of my patients find it helpful during difficult periods. Before Shaun could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his surveillance system. Tiffany had just entered a downtown hotel. One not on her usual route or class schedule. The timing couldn't have been worse. But then again, nothing in Shaun's life seemed to happen by chance anymore. Tiffany had become careless, or perhaps she thought he wouldn't notice. Either way, this was a critical development. Shaun's thoughts were interrupted by his next scheduled appointment, couples therapy with Tiffany. Surprisingly, she had agreed, though he suspected it was more for show than any genuine desire to work through their problems. The session was illuminating. Tiffany's manipulation was almost textbook. She spun the narrative effortlessly, painting herself as the victim of a controlling, distrustful husband. "He's always been intense," she told Dr. Sarah Martinez, her voice breaking as if she were on the verge of tears. "But lately, it's different. The constant questions, the way he monitors my schedule. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating." Shaun maintained his composure, letting her take the spotlight. "I want to understand what's changing in our relationship," he said carefully, not letting his irritation show. "When communication breaks down, suspicion fills the gap." "Suspicion?" Tiffany's voice rose, taking on a familiar tone of accusation. "See, he doesn't trust me. Everything I do is questioned. My work, my friends, my independence." Shaun had to give her credit. She was good. The performance was so convincing he almost admired it. But he wasn't fooled. He'd seen hardened operatives crack under less skilled manipulation. That evening, as he reviewed his surveillance data, something caught his eye. Matthew's business empire was beginning to show signs of strain. The latest set of board meeting minutes, obtained through carefully placed sources, revealed growing concerns about Matthew's erratic behavior and frequent absences. His empire was unraveling, and Shaun had a front-row seat. But just as he was about to dive deeper into the information, disaster struck. A fire broke out in Shaun's home office that night, devastating the room and destroying several files. Shaun wasn't worried. He had prepared for this. The files that Tiffany and Matthew thought they were targeting were decoys. Vital intelligence had been stored elsewhere, hidden from view. The fire investigators confirmed what Shaun had already suspected. "It's definitely professional work," the lead investigator told him, "but they were sloppy. Left too much evidence." Shaun nodded, playing the concerned homeowner. On the inside, however, he was calm. This was exactly what he had anticipated. The attack had only revealed more about Matthew's resources. And more importantly, his vulnerabilities. The game was escalating, but Shaun had expected this. Each move made by his opponents was only making them easier to track, easier to predict. Their desperation was showing, and soon they would make a mistake. In the secure basement room of his house, surrounded by monitors displaying surveillance feeds, financial records, and intelligence reports, Shaun began to plan his next move. Tiffany and Matthew believed they were dealing with a former MI6 operative turned security consultant. They were wrong. They were about to learn just how dangerous a man could be when pushed too far. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Garrett. "Whatever you're planning, remember, no official MI6 resources. You're on your own for this one." Shaun smiled coldly as he read the message. He'd been on his own before, many times. It wasn't his enemies who should be worried about the lack of support. It was Tiffany and Matthew. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. Shaun's mind was already calculating the possibilities. The young man, though impressive in his observations, wasn't here by coincidence. A part of him knew this was no random encounter. His training and instincts kicked into high gear, measuring the newcomer's demeanor, his movements, and the subtle nuances in his speech. There was something familiar about him, but Shaun kept his thoughts masked under a neutral expression. "You've got a good eye," Shaun said, his tone casual as he wiped down the sweat from his forehead with a towel. "You train here?" The young man nodded, shifting his weight slightly. "I've been around, picking up techniques here and there. You're obviously no amateur." Shaun assessed the situation, sensing the man's caution. He was testing him, just like Shaun was doing with him. The encounter could be a random fluke, or it could be something more, something orchestrated. "I like to learn from the best," the young man said, his voice friendly, though there was an edge to it. A subtle challenge that piqued Shaun's curiosity. "Well, if you're serious, you'll stick around. I'm here most mornings." Shaun replied, turning his attention back to the mat. It was a standard response, but Shaun didn't miss the slight, almost imperceptible look the young man gave him before he turned to leave. The moment the young man walked out of the gym, Shaun's mind raced through scenarios. He could dismiss it as nothing, but his instincts had never failed him. It was more than a coincidence. Someone was watching him, and they weren't just trying to learn martial arts techniques. They were scouting him. But for what? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Garrett. "You're not the only one who's been keeping an eye on things. Be careful. There are bigger players involved now. Matthew is out of his depth. The question is, how far will he take this?" Shaun's eyes narrowed. His suspicion about Matthew's increasing desperation was right. Matthew was in over his head, and now it seemed like more powerful people were involved. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and Shaun was no longer just playing defense. He was preparing for a war. Later that evening, as Shaun reviewed the footage of Tiffany's confrontation with her mother, a thought struck him. Tiffany's refusal to acknowledge the truth was one thing, but cutting off her family completely raised the stakes. Was she just trying to distance herself from any potential liability? Or was she already planning her next move, securing her alliances for the final push? He knew better than to get emotionally entangled. My6 had taught him how to compartmentalize, how to suppress emotions for the greater good. But this was different. Tiffany had crossed a line, and every piece of evidence, every betrayal, was pushing him closer to a breaking point. But he would remain in control. That's what he did best. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from Joan Kelly, his concerned neighbor. She was one of the few people left who still seemed to care. He had avoided her recently, but her messages were becoming more frequent, more urgent. "Shaun, I need to talk to you. It's about Tiffany. She's been acting strange. There's something wrong, and I don't think she's the only one." The message hung in his mind as he dialed her number. "Juan," he answered after the second ring, his voice steady but with a subtle urgency that matched the tension building inside him. "What's going on? I've been trying to get a hold of you for days. It's about Matthew, and I don't know how to say this, but he's not just involved in the yoga studio anymore. I overheard something. He's been in contact with some very dangerous people. Gangsters, Shaun, and Tiffany, she's tied up in all of it." Shaun's heart skipped a beat. This was more than just an affair. Tiffany was embedded in something far darker than he had imagined. And Matthew's connections? He knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. Criminals, yes, but they were more than that. Powerful men and women who played a game far beyond the petty schemes of a yoga studio or a disgruntled wife. "I need you to stay quiet about this, Joan. Don't get involved any further," Shaun said, his voice hardening. "But thank you for telling me. It's more serious than I thought." As the call ended, Shaun's mind moved rapidly, analyzing the new information. Matthew was playing with fire, and Tiffany, for all her manipulation, was now a part of something that threatened more than just their marriage. This was about survival, and the stakes had been raised. He was no longer just protecting his pride, he was protecting his life. The next morning, as the sun barely broke through the fog, Shaun was already out the door, preparing for what came next. The young man from the martial arts gym was still fresh in his memory, and Shaun couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was no accident. Every move now felt like a potential threat, a game of chess where the wrong move could cost him everything. But this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. He walked into his secure basement office, the place where his past work for MI6 had prepared him for this very moment. Multiple screens flashed with data. Matthew's financials, his travel patterns, and now, even the odd interactions of his connections with dangerous players. Shaun smiled coldly as he made his next move. He was no longer the man who took orders from MI6. He was no longer the man who was manipulated by his wife or her lover. He was a man driven by precision, strategy, and the singular goal of reclaiming control. Tiffany and Matthew had underestimated him. Now it was time to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Shaun's mind raced as he processed the damning evidence. Tiffany and Matthew had underestimated him, believing that they could pull off their scheme without consequences. He had always been one step ahead, but now, as the full scope of their betrayal unfolded before him, he knew it was time to act. There would be no more waiting, no more playing defense. This was no longer about gathering evidence or maintaining control. It was about striking when they least expected it. Ismail's words echoed in Shaun's mind. The young man had been sharp, quick to notice the surveillance and the players working against him. There was something about the way Ismail observed, how he never seemed to miss a detail, that reminded Shaun of his younger self. The potential in Ismail was undeniable, and while Shaun had yet to decide if the man could be trusted, there was no doubt that his skills were valuable. But first, Shaun had to finish what he started with Tiffany and Matthew. The cyber attack earlier that day had been the final confirmation Shaun needed. Whoever had initiated it had underestimated him, thinking they could probe his defenses for weak spots. The attempt had been crude, easily deflected, and the false data he'd allowed to be stolen had already set the stage for a false narrative. They had expected Shaun to fall into their trap. Instead, they had walked into his. Shaun sat back in his chair, his fingers idly tapping the desk in rhythm with the pulsing beat of his thoughts. Tiffany's breakdown at the gala had been nothing short of theatrical. The drama, the tears, the calculated emotional outbursts, all part of the mask she wore in public. But it was her private conversation with Matthew that had solidified the next phase of his plan. It was one thing for her to accuse him in front of a room full of people, but it was another entirely for her to talk about eliminating him so casually. Shaun wasn't surprised. The world she and Matthew had built was one of manipulation, deceit, and ruthless ambition. They thought they were playing chess, but they hadn't realized that they were only pawns in a game far more dangerous than they could comprehend. With a cool, methodical focus, Shaun moved to his private server. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing files and records that he had kept hidden away for just such an occasion. Protocol 0. His last line of defense, his most extreme contingency plan, was now live. There would be no going back. The screen in front of him lit up, displaying an array of encrypted files, personal dossiers, and financial records. His plan had always been to use his resources as a last resort, but Tiffany and Matthew had forced his hand. They wanted to play in the shadows, thinking they could orchestrate his downfall without ever facing the consequences. Now, they would learn that Shaun Jordan was no ordinary man. His reputation, earned through years of training and experience, was built on precision, patience, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. Initiate secondary protocols, Shaun muttered, watching as the system hummed to life. The screens flashed with activity as the first phase of his counterattack began. The surveillance systems were updated, locking onto Tiffany and Matthew's movements with pinpoint accuracy. Every phone call, every transaction, every interaction with their associates would now be tracked. They would have nowhere to hide. Shaun's mind shifted gears. He no longer needed to rely on others' mistakes. He had everything in place. The financial manipulations, the shady connections, the false alibis. All of it was now his weapon, ready to be deployed at the perfect moment. It was time to strike. He walked to his safe, unlocking it with a smooth, practiced motion. Inside, hidden beneath layers of protective padding, was a small, unassuming file, a collection of documents he had kept from his MI6 days. This file held the final piece of his plan, the leverage he needed to dismantle Tiffany and Matthew's empire once and for all. Tiffany thought she had outsmarted him. She thought she could betray him, manipulate him, and leave him powerless, but she had failed to recognize the most important lesson of all. Shaun Jordan was never the one to be underestimated. As the night stretched on, Shaun's thoughts were cold, calculated. The silence in the room was deafening, yet it was the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. He would make sure that when Tiffany and Matthew finally realized what had happened, it would be too late. The game had changed, and they would be caught in a web of their own making. Shaun's phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a text from Nate. Matthew's meeting with the enforcers again. This time, he's bringing in someone new. Could be trouble. Shaun didn't respond. He had everything he needed. The next move was already in motion. A soft growl from Max echoed in the hallway, a familiar sound that brought Shaun's focus back to the present. The dog had always been a loyal companion, but tonight, Shaun couldn't help but feel a slight pang of regret. Max didn't deserve any of this. He had been a part of the family, a loyal protector, and now he was caught up in a mess of betrayal and manipulation. The time had come. Shaun stood up, adjusting his shirt as he moved toward the door. The night air felt colder than usual, as if even the world itself recognized the shift in the balance of power. This was the beginning of the end for Tiffany and Matthew. They had played their hand, and now it was Shaun's turn to finish the game. With everything in place and his resolve stronger than ever, Shaun knew the next few days would determine the course of his life. Would they try to retaliate? Would they attempt to flee? Or would they attempt one last desperate move to take him down? Whatever it was, Shaun was ready, and he would make them wish they had never crossed him. Operation Black Dawn. Shaun's phone buzzed at 4:30 a.m. A text message appeared. Training exercise initiated. Alpha team en route. ETA, 20 minutes. Shaun checked his surveillance feeds. 3 men in dark clothing lurked near his usual running route, attempting to blend into the pre-dawn darkness. Amateur work. They positioned themselves too close to the streetlights, creating distinct silhouettes. Confirm positions, Shaun typed into his encrypted communicator. 4 green dots appeared on his tactical display, marking his team's locations around the neighborhood. At 5:15 a.m., dressed in his running gear, Shaun stepped out his front door. Tiffany watched from the bedroom window, her silhouette visible against the curtains. He could picture her satisfied smile, thinking their plan was working perfectly. The first attacker made his move near the park entrance. A heavy-set man in a black hoodie, moving with the clumsy aggression of a street thug. Shaun maintained his pace, appearing oblivious until the last moment. The man lunged, switchblade glinting. Shaun's response was brutal and efficient, a precision strike to the throat followed by a knee to the solar plexus. The attacker hadn't even hit the ground before Shaun's team moved in. "Target secured," a voice whispered in Shaun's earpiece. 2 more approaching from the south. The remaining thugs walked straight into the trap. Marcus, Shaun's demolitions expert, emerged from behind a parked van. Sarah, his infiltration specialist, stepped out of the shadows of a doorway. The takedowns were swift, professional, and completely silent. "Area contained," Marcus reported. "No witnesses. No cameras." "Hey!" Shaun approached the first attacker, who wheezed on the ground, clutching his throat. "Let's have a chat about Matthew Robison." 2 hours later, in an abandoned warehouse converted into a command center, Trina Gillespie reviewed the morning's footage. Clean work. They never saw it coming. "Talk to me about the intel," Shaun demanded, studying the multiple screens displaying surveillance feeds, financial records, and intelligence reports. "They're singing beautifully," Trina replied, pulling up a series of documents. "Matthew hired them through an intermediary, Tony Pescatori, small-time enforcer with gambling debts. He claims Matthew promised to clear his markers in exchange for arranging the hit." Shaun's sister, Amanda, walked in, carrying a thick file. "I've compiled psychological profiles on both targets," she said. Tiffany's behavior patterns suggest narcissistic personality traits combined with opportunistic tendencies. She's not just following Matthew's lead, she's actively participating in the planning. "The money trail confirms it," Trina added. She's been skimming funds from the yoga studio, converting them to cryptocurrency. Matthew's teaching her his tricks. Shaun's phone lit up with a message from one of his street contacts. Tiffany had just arrived at the yoga studio, right on schedule. She had no idea her alibi was meaningless. Now, what about Matthew's criminal connections? Shaun asked, turning to the tactical display. Bigger than we thought, Trina responded. The captured thugs mentioned meetings with representatives from the Kovac syndicate. Apparently, Matthew's been promising them access to high-end real estate for money laundering operations. Amanda studied her brother's expression. You're not surprised? Matthew's trying to play in waters too deep for him, Shaun replied. The Kovacs don't tolerate amateurs. Shaun's mind raced as he processed the new information. Matthew's attempts to involve the Kovac syndicate revealed a dangerous new level to his treachery. The Kovacs were ruthless, and getting entangled with them would be the end of anyone who couldn't keep their promises. And Matthew was already skating on thin ice. Shaun stood up, stretching his legs as he walked over to the display table where the intelligence gathered on Matthew and Tiffany was being compiled. The pieces were all falling into place, but there were still gaps. Dangerous gaps. There was a sense of finality hanging in the air, but Shaun knew better than to assume victory until the final card was played. Matthew and Tiffany had underestimated him, but that didn't mean they were done yet. We need to tighten the noose, Shaun said quietly, his voice steady, betraying no hint of emotion despite the mounting pressure. Matthew's meeting with the Kovacs will be our opportunity. Trina looked up from the data feed she was analyzing. What's your plan? I'll make sure Matthew gets the message. We're not dealing with amateurs anymore. Shaun's gaze was piercing, as if visualizing the operation in his mind's eye. He knew exactly what needed to happen, and he wasn't willing to wait much longer. It was time to move forward, to transition from observation to action. Shaun's phone buzzed again, this time a brief text from an encrypted number. It's time to show them the consequences. The words were clear. One final push, and everything would collapse. Shaun quickly typed a response. Confirming coordinates. Turning back to the team, Shaun issued orders without hesitation. We move at 2,200. Everyone in position. Keep it tight. No room for error. If this goes south, we all go down. Let's finish it. As the team began preparing for the operation, Shaun's mind flashed to Tiffany's face. The false tears, the manipulation, the lies. Her betrayal stung, but Shaun had long since mastered detachment. He couldn't afford to be distracted by sentimentality. The only thing that mattered now was bringing everything to a conclusion. Later that evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, Shaun's team was already in position. He stood in front of the mirror in his private quarters, adjusting his gear. His reflection stared back at him, the weight of the past few months evident in the hard lines of his face. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. This was about eliminating a threat, one that had slowly and deliberately encroached upon his life. Matthew had crossed a line, and Tiffany had chosen her side. Shaun stepped out the door, his mind sharp and clear. His phone buzzed again. A message from Amanda. No sign of Tiffany leaving the studio yet. Good, Shaun muttered to himself, sliding the phone into his pocket as he entered his vehicle. As he drove, the city lights streaked by, the hum of the engine beneath him a constant reminder of the urgency in the air. He arrived at the designated safe house just as night fell completely, the area bathed in darkness. The Kovac syndicate meeting was set to take place at a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. It was a private venue, tucked away from prying eyes, a perfect setting for illegal deals to unfold, unnoticed. The cold, calculated environment felt familiar to Shaun, one he had navigated countless times in his previous life. He pulled the collar of his jacket higher, masking his face with a dark scarf as he exited the vehicle. His team was already in position, and Shaun briefed them quickly. This is a high-stakes move. Kovac's men will be heavily armed, and we need to get Matthew alive. The syndicate needs to know who they're dealing with. We've got one shot at this. The operation began smoothly. Everyone in position, moving silently through the darkened streets, melting into the shadows as they approached the venue. Shaun's heart rate remained steady. Every step calculated, every move a part of the plan. His focus never wavered. As the syndicate representatives arrived, Shaun's team infiltrated the area, positioning themselves around the venue. Shaun, moving swiftly through the darkness, watched as Matthew entered the building, flanked by his usual entourage of thugs. It was showtime. Shaun's voice came over the earpiece, low and commanding. "Initiate Phase 1. A series of quiet explosions erupted, not far from the venue. The shockwave rattled the windows, throwing everyone into a state of panic. The diversion worked perfectly. As expected, the syndicate goons scrambled for cover, momentarily distracted from the real objective. Shaun moved swiftly, his team close behind. They secured the perimeter and cleared the building, moving silently through the structure. The tension in the air was palpable. This was it. No more games, no more chances for mistakes. They found Matthew in the inner room, a look of shock on his face as he realized the trap had been sprung. Shaun stepped into the doorway, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "You've made a lot of enemies, Matthew," Shaun said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Matthew, his face pale, opened his mouth to speak, but Shaun wasn't interested in his excuses. His hand shot out, grabbing Matthew by the collar and pulling him close. "No more lies," Shaun growled. "I've seen enough. You thought you could play me, but this ends now." Before Matthew could respond, a gunshot rang out from the back of the room. One of the syndicate men, clearly unwilling to play by the rules, had made a move. Shaun, without hesitation, turned his attention to the shooter, neutralizing the threat in one swift motion. The gunman crumpled to the floor, his body twitching before stilling. Matthew, now visibly sweating, pleaded with Shaun. "You don't understand. I was just trying to—" "Shut up!" Shaun interjected. "Your time's up." With a single motion, he incapacitated Matthew's remaining guards. The syndicate men had underestimated Shaun, and it cost them dearly. They were now in the midst of a game they had no chance of winning. Shaun leaned in, his voice cold and final. "This is your last chance, Matthew. Tell me everything about the Kovacs Syndicate's operations, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live to see another day." Matthew swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his mind racing. But Shaun wasn't interested in giving him any more time to think. The pressure was on, and there was only one way out. "You think you can walk away from this?" Shaun said, as the room grew even colder. "I don't think so." The tension in the command center was palpable as the team geared up for Phase 2. Each member of Shaun's team had been chosen not only for their skill set but for their unwavering loyalty and their ability to adapt to the brutal, strategic nature of Shaun's plans. Shaun's plans. The chief, they were no longer dealing with petty criminals. Matthew and Tiffany's betrayal had opened a door to something far more dangerous. Shaun knew it would take everything he had, everything his team had, to dismantle the empire they had built. As the hours passed, the team synchronized their movements, each task finely tuned to ensure that the operation ran like clockwork. Marcus, the demolitions expert, had already secured all necessary materials for infiltration, while Sarah meticulously reviewed the building schematics, looking for weak points in Matthew's various business locations. Shaun's mind raced as he mapped out each next step, anticipating the moves of his enemies. The message from Garrett earlier in the day still lingered in his mind. While the MI6 handler had been trying to distance himself from the operation, there were things he couldn't ignore. 3 of Tony Pescatore's associates had been found unconscious near Lincoln Park, an event that was being swept under the rug. The sudden redirection of several local investigations into organized crime made it clear that Matthew's network had reached further than Shaun had originally thought. Garrett's words about staying unofficial were a reminder. This was no longer just a matter of personal revenge. It was war. As he studied the feeds of Matthew's movements, he realized how close they were to pulling the rug out from under him. The panic in Matthew's eyes when he arrived at the Drake Hotel spoke volumes. This wasn't the same confident man Shaun had once known. Matthew had played his hand, and now the game had turned. Shaun turned his attention to Tiffany, who had just finished teaching her evening class. Despite her composed appearance, Shaun knew the cracks were beginning to show. Her every move, every word, was being tracked, and every secret they thought was safe was being carefully unraveled. "They think they're so clever," Amanda remarked, watching Tiffany on one of the surveillance screens. "They're confident," Shaun replied. "And that confidence is their greatest weakness. They believe they've been in control this entire time, that they're ahead of me, but they're not. We've been playing this game from the start." Tiffany's false image as the victimized wife, constantly building her social media narrative, was beginning to unravel. Her connections with Matthew's criminal network were becoming clearer with each intercepted message and every digital trail. Shaun had already established key links to her financial schemes, but it was the deeper layers of manipulation that were truly alarming. She hadn't just been complicit. She had been actively participating in building a financial empire behind Shaun's back, one that now seemed on the verge of collapse. "She's been skimming from the studio and funneling it into cryptocurrency," Trina added. "The moment we freeze those accounts, everything falls apart." Shaun allowed himself a small, satisfied smirk. "Let them think they have everything in place. They're underestimating the scale of what they've done." As the final preparations for Phase 2 were made, the first targets were clear. Matthew's real estate properties, especially the ones connected to his shady dealings with the Kobach syndicate. These properties would be the starting point for the dismantling of his empire. But Shaun knew that wasn't enough. He needed to hit them where it hurt, directly in the heart of their operations. The Kovats were not to be underestimated. They controlled vast amounts of illicit wealth and had a reputation for ruthlessness. If Matthew thought he could play with them, he was gravely mistaken. Shaun had already gathered intel on their leaders and was ready to exploit every crack in their criminal network. But, as with everything Shaun did, there would be no rush. The longer this dragged on, the more Matthew and Tiffany would expose themselves. Shaun leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on the live feed of Matthew's meeting at the Drake Hotel. The man was rattled, but still dangerous. He had the resources and the connections, but Shaun was confident in his team's abilities. They were prepared for any move Matthew might make. Phase 2 had begun, and Shaun was ready to strike. "Marcus," Shaun said into his comms, "set the plan in motion. We move on the real estate properties tonight, and remember, no witnesses, no loose ends." "Understood," Marcus's voice came back, steady as always. As they made their way to their respective targets, the gravity of Shaun's position settled in. He was no longer just a husband betrayed. He was a man at war. Every move, every decision had consequences, and this time there would be no room for mercy. Tiffany and Matthew had made their bed. Now they would lie in it. Back at the yoga studio, Tiffany sat in her office, reviewing yet another set of transactions. She was unaware that every transfer, every deal, was being tracked. Unbeknownst to her, Shaun had already initiated the financial freeze, locking down every account she had so carefully constructed. "A Phase 2 is a go," Shaun muttered under his breath as he reviewed the security footage from the studio's surveillance cameras. "You're running out of time, Tiffany." And as the night wore on, the stakes continued to rise. Operation Black Dawn was more than a mission. It was the beginning of the end for Matthew Robertson and Tiffany Jordan. Shaun had been underestimated by everyone, except by those who truly knew him. With Phase 2 set in motion, Shaun knew the final act was fast approaching, and when it came, it would be absolute. They had chosen this path, believing him vulnerable. Now, they would learn why Shaun Jordan's enemies spoke his name in whispers and why betrayal always carried the highest price. Escalation. Matthew Roberson's hands shook as he poured his third scotch of the morning. The amber liquid swirled in his glass, but he barely noticed it. His office at Roberson Enterprises, once a proud symbol of his success, his climb from nothing to a respected businessman, now felt like a trap. The walls, once adorned with awards and memorabilia, now seemed to close in around him. The disappearance of his hired muscle, the thugs meant to handle Shaun and any interference, had left him exposed, vulnerable. Even worse, it was clear that the small cracks in his empire were quickly becoming gaping fissures. Shaun's reach was far longer than he had ever anticipated. "Mr. Roberson?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, the sharpness in her tone a stark contrast to the calm he so desperately tried to maintain. "The board members are waiting in the conference room." Matthew straightened his tie and took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The room felt colder as he walked through the double doors, his steps deliberate but slow. The boardroom was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the sleek wooden table. The faces of his directors were unreadable, but he could feel their judgment. Richard Kensington, the head of the board, was the first to speak. His voice was calm, but the sharpness of his words cut through the tension in the air. "Care to explain these numbers?" Richard pushed a financial report across the table. Matthew's gaze drifted over the figures, but his mind was elsewhere. On the whispered conversations he had overheard from the Kovacs Syndicate's representatives, on the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach, on the fact that even now something felt off. Her Chicago properties are hemorrhaging money. 3 development projects halted due to permit issues that mysteriously appeared overnight. Kensington's tone was accusatory, though his eyes never left the paper in front of him. "Temporary setbacks," Matthew assured them, though his voice trembled slightly, betraying his nerves. "I have people handling the situation." Richard leaned forward, his fingers tapping the report with a growing sense of impatience. "Like you handled the Davidson merger?" he shot back, his words laced with sharp sarcasm. "They pulled out this morning." No explanation. The blood drained from Matthew's face as the words hit him. He knew the real reason they pulled out. His own desperation had forced him to make desperate promises to secure his position, and it had all started to unravel. Behind the scenes, Shaun's team was watching it all unfold. "His empire's cracking," Trina noted, her voice quiet but filled with satisfaction as she monitored the hidden camera feeds from their command center. Marcus, their demolitions expert, leaned in, eyes narrowed on the screen. "Those permit issues weren't cheap to arrange." "Money well spent," Shaun replied coldly, his gaze fixed on Matthew's diminishing composure. The once proud CEO was now reduced to a man on the verge of collapse, his facade crumbling with every passing minute. A separate screen lit up, showing Tiffany arriving at her parents' house. A mic placed outside the Bird residence captured the heated conversation inside. Tiffany's voice was sharp, desperate. "Mom, Dad, you have to help me," Tiffany pleaded, her carefully crafted image of the victim slipping through the cracks as the tears flowed, perfectly staged. "Hush, Shaun. He's not who you think he is." The controlling behavior, the accusations, the threats. "Ha ha," Esther Bird's voice, cold and full of disappointment, cut through the tension. "Threats, like the ones your boyfriend's associates made against your husband?" Tiffany paused, her mask momentarily slipping. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion, but there was no hiding the flicker of panic that danced in her eyes. "Don't play innocent," Esther snapped, her voice rising with anger. "I've been doing my own investigating. Those yoga workshops in Miami, I called the venue. They've never heard of Shaun Jordan's studios." Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. "You're spying on me? Just like Shaun?" "No, Tiffany. I'm protecting what's left of this family's dignity. Get out. Don't come back until you're ready to tell the truth." The conversation ended there, leaving Tiffany standing outside in the cold, her carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel. Back at the command center, Shaun's team monitored multiple operations, each contributing to the collapse of Matthew and Tiffany's empire. Marcus reported success in disrupting Matthew's legitimate business ventures. Contract problems, permit issues, delayed shipments, all coordinated, precise. Good, Shaun murmured, nodding in approval. Push harder. Sarah's cyber team had infected Matthew's company's networks with subtle glitches, eroding client confidence. They were slowly choking the life out of Robertson Enterprises, one glitch at a time. The Kovacs syndicate is getting impatient, Ismail reported, returning from his street-level reconnaissance. His voice was low, tinged with frustration. Their enforcers are asking questions about Matthew's promises. They wanted prime real estate for money laundering, not excuse. Shaun didn't flinch at the news. Push them harder, he instructed, his tone icy. I want Matthew feeling pressure from all sides. Trina's voice broke in with urgency. You need to see this. She pulled up a set of shipping manifests. Documents that revealed a disturbing pattern hidden within the legitimate cargo shipments. Women brought in from Eastern Europe, listed as specialized training staff for the yoga studio chain. Trina's voice carried a cold fury, an emotion they all knew well. Human trafficking. Shaun leaned in, his expression hardening as the gravity of the situation sank in. Is Tiffany involved? She signs off on the staff paperwork, Trina replied, her eyes narrowed in disbelief. She claims ignorance, but the money trail suggests otherwise. The revelation threatened to complicate Shaun's plans. Human trafficking was a federal issue, and the federal authorities were already poking around, their attention dangerously close to the edges of Shaun's operations. Just then, Marcus called out from his station. Matthew's making moves. Multiple calls to known associates trying to accelerate his plans against you. The surveillance feed showed Matthew in his office, desperation evident in his every movement. I don't care what it costs, he shouted into his phone. Find someone who can handle this. The Kovacs, the Brava, anyone. Shaun knew this was the breaking point. Matthew's sloppiness was drawing attention from all the wrong places. His sloppiness is drawing attention, Garrett warned during their secure call. 3 federal agencies have opened preliminary investigations. I can redirect some of it, but you need to move faster. Shaun's health monitor beeped, his blood pressure spiking as the weight of everything began to settle on him. Dr. Johnston's warnings echoed in his mind, but Shaun pushed them aside. Physical discomfort was a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things he would endure. Boss? Sarah's voice came through the speaker, urgency lacing her words. Tiffany's PR campaign is gaining traction. Local news picked up her story. They're painting you as an abusive ex-cop who couldn't handle his wife's success. The media coverage was working its magic. Tiffany, with her perfectly orchestrated tears and victim narrative, was gaining sympathy from the public, further twisting the perception of Shaun as the villain. He couldn't stand that I was building something for myself. Tiffany's voice echoed through the room, breaking with emotion as the cameras flashed. The constant monitoring, the accusations, the implicit threats. Amanda studied the reactions. The community's turning against you, she said, reading the social media backlash. Several of your neighbors have come forward with evidence of controlling behavior. Shaun's gaze was steady, unwavering as he processed the information. His expression remained cold, calculating. Let them believe what they want. Public opinion is irrelevant to the endgame. It was clear to everyone in the room now. Shaun had anticipated this, planned for it. The game was far from over. The tension in the air was palpable as Shaun's team worked in silence, watching their carefully orchestrated plans unfold with a precision that left no room for error. They had been prepared for everything, except betrayal from within. Nate's treachery had been the final straw. Shaun trusted no one but his team now, and even that trust was fraying. The breach had been methodical, clean and quick, Whoever was behind it knew exactly where to target, and that knowledge had sent a chill through Shaun's spine. He stood in the command center, his eyes cold as he reviewed the breach logs. Trina worked swiftly, isolating Nate's access points while the rest of the team fortified their systems. But Shaun's mind was elsewhere. There was something about the way Nate had acted during their last mission. A small detail that now seemed like a sign, but it was too late to undo what had been done. "We're not just playing defense anymore," Shaun said, his voice low and controlled. "I want the entire secondary system scrubbed. Make sure nothing, no trace, gets out of here." The team worked with relentless focus, but the emotional weight of the betrayal hung heavily in the room. Nate had been more than just a colleague. He was a friend, a brother in arms. Yet betrayal had a way of making those lines blur, turning once familiar faces into potential threats. The media circus surrounding Tiffany's divorce proceedings only fueled the fire. With her victim narrative gaining traction, public opinion had started to shift against Shaun. His name, once synonymous with quiet strength and control, was now associated with the image of a jilted, obsessive ex-husband. They'd underestimated him. But Shaun wasn't concerned with their misguided opinions. The truth had always been his weapon. "Set the trap tighter," Shaun ordered coldly. "We're about to make them believe they're winning." As the team continued their work, Marcus and Sarah ramped up the disruption protocols. They sabotaged Matthew's business deals, interfered with his real estate acquisitions, and quietly ensured that every criminal ally Matthew tried to lean on was systematically isolated or turned against him. Shaun's pulse remained steady, despite the mounting pressure, despite the broken alliances and the ever-tightening web around Matthew and Tiffany. Shaun was in control. Every failure on their part only tightened his grip, and soon their world would collapse in on itself. But even as his plans took shape, new complications emerged. The State Department's interest in Matthew's international dealings had escalated the stakes. The last thing Shaun needed was federal intervention, complicating his already delicate web. Garrett's warning came as no surprise, but it added a new layer of urgency to their operations. "How much time?" Shaun had asked, his focus unwavering as he examined the map of Matthew's real estate deals, human trafficking routes, and shady business dealings. "Yes," Garrett had replied. "Maybe less. You need to move faster." And so they did. Shaun's team worked with ruthless efficiency, accelerating their plans and focusing on dismantling Matthew's empire piece by piece. Yet even as they pushed forward, new threats emerged. Tiffany's belief that she had the upper hand with the restraining order was misplaced. As her PR campaign spread, Shaun's team quietly shifted the tide, manipulating the situation with a precision that was almost surgical. In Tiffany's mind, her victory was secure. The legal system would protect her, her social connections and the community would shield her. But she didn't realize that every digital move she made was being tracked. Every piece of her facade was slowly crumbling away. And Matthew, despite his bravado, was unraveling. His meetings with the Kovacs syndicate had only fueled his desperation. He was alone, unguarded, and easy to manipulate. The moment he walked into the mob meeting, the clock started ticking. "Push harder," Shaun had ordered. "I want them desperate. I want them to believe they can escape. Let them make mistakes." Shaun's voice, though filled with cold calculation, carried a weight of finality. The plan was nearing its peak. The surveillance on Matthew had already revealed cracks in his armor. He had made a series of erratic calls, his confidence shattered. The Kovacs, normally a ruthless and efficient organization, were starting to turn on him. His calls for help went unanswered, and his attempts to rally support only added to his unraveling. Back in the command center, Shaun's eyes never wavered from the screen, his mind always calculating the next move. He could feel the shift in the air. Tiffany, Matthew, and everyone else involved were being led into a trap that would be impossible to escape. They had thought they could outmaneuver him. They had thought they could use the law. Their allies, and their schemes to protect themselves. But they were about to learn the hard way that Shaun Jordan was not someone they could outsmart. He was a predator, and they were his prey. Their mistakes were his leverage. As Tiffany poured herself another glass of champagne, Matthew made his last call for help, unaware that his every move was being watched, every secret uncovered. They thought they had won, but Shaun Jordan was just getting started. The counter-strike. In the command center, Shaun's operation unfolded with precision. He watched, stoic, as the chaos he orchestrated spread like wildfire. "Begin information dissemination. Let's see how they handle fighting ghosts," Shaun commanded. His voice was calm, but his eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating fire. This was more than just retaliation, it was a lesson. Trina, the tech mastermind, moved swiftly, her fingers dancing across the keyboard, initiating the misinformation protocols that would shatter Matthew's fragile empire. Within hours, Matthew's criminal contacts began receiving conflicting intelligence about his activities. False leads designed to sow distrust and confusion. "Package delivered to the Kovac." The first message came through, a whisper of deception. "Payment confirmed. Deal with the Brava finalized." The second read. "Kovac territory compromised." Another damning message meant to turn allies into enemies. Matthew's phone buzzed constantly, messages flooding in from his underworld connections, each one more furious than the last. Each believed Matthew had betrayed them for their rivals, fueling their paranoia and distrust. It wasn't long before the very people who had once supported him turned against him. "Your digital warfare strategy is working," Marcus reported from his station, his eyes glued to the chaotic flood of messages on Matthew's phone. "His communications are in total disarray. He can't contact his allies without triggering suspicion." "His legitimate business partners are jumping ship too," Sarah added, her tone cool but laced with satisfaction. 3 board members resigned this morning. The stock's in free fall. Matthew's on the verge of losing it all. Shaun watched the monitors, his expression unreadable. Matthew's desperation was almost palpable now, and every failed attempt to reach his offshore accounts only deepened the hole he was digging for himself. His access was mysteriously restricted, leaving him powerless to salvage his crumbling empire. "Sir," Ismael's voice cut through the silence. "You have a visitor." Shaun turned, his eyes narrowing as Esther Bird, Tiffany's mother, entered the command center. She held a thick folder in her hands, her face steely with determination. She took in the high-tech setup before her, her eyes betraying the slightest hint of awe, but she remained composed. "I've been conducting my own investigation," Esther said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She placed the folder on the table in front of Shaun. "Bank statements, phone records, hotel receipts." Shaun flipped through the folder, scanning the evidence. It wasn't just an affair Tiffany had been having. No, Tiffany had been complicit in something far darker, helping Matthew target other wealthy spouses for his schemes. It was a disturbing revelation, but it fit perfectly into Shaun's plans. "How long have you known?" Shaun asked, his tone cold, though there was a flicker of genuine curiosity. Esther's gaze hardened as she met his. "I suspected when she started the yoga studio. The numbers never added up. I raced her better than this." She paused for a moment before continuing, her voice softer but resolute. "Whatever you're planning, I won't interfere." Before Shaun could respond, an urgent alert flashed across the screen, snapping back to the operation. Crush, Shaun, one of Matthew's warehouses, had reported a major drug shipment missing. The security footage revealed local police conducting a surprise raid, one that was eerily well-timed. "Garrett's handiwork?" Trina asked, her brow furrowing as she analyzed the data. Shaun nodded. "He's making it look like Matthew's operation was exposed through routine surveillance. The timing couldn't be better. This will add another layer of confusion for Matthew." Matthew's world was rapidly crumbling, and Shaun reveled in every moment of it. The criminal underworld reacted exactly as Shaun had planned. Matthew's phone lit up with angry threats from his former associates, each one blaming him for betraying their interests to save himself. It was a web of distrust and infighting that would unravel everything Matthew had built. "Boss," Sarah reported, her voice calm but tinged with satisfaction. "Tiffany's trying to access your joint accounts. The automatic alerts just triggered." The team watched as Tiffany, desperate and increasingly frantic, stood in front of an ATM. She punched in her information, but the machine rejected her cards. The frustration was evident on her face as she tried again and again, only to be met with the same result. Her phone rang, but it was no use. Matthew's phone had been disabled, courtesy of Trina's digital warfare. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jordan," a calm, almost disinterested voice said over the phone. "These transactions have been flagged for potential fraud. We'll need to conduct a full investigation." Tiffany's face twisted in confusion and anger as she hung up the phone. She didn't know it yet, but her financial empire was as fragile as Matthew's. Her calls to him went straight to voicemail. His phone was silent, his ability to communicate severed by the team's efforts. "Tracking her movements now," Sarah reported. "She's driving between banks, each one rejecting her attempts. Her options are running out." Meanwhile, the criminal elements in Matthew's world were also feeling the heat. The Kovac and Brava syndicates, realizing they'd both been manipulated, formed a temporary alliance against their common enemy. They turned their sights on Matthew, believing he had sacrificed their interest to save his own. "Perfect," Shaun muttered, his gaze cold and focused on the monitors. "Let them tear each other apart. Each confrontation provides more evidence for law enforcement." Garrett's secure line buzzed, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's done. The evidence has been discovered by routine patrols. Local law enforcement is building a case. Without realizing, they're following our breadcrumbs." Shaun nodded, satisfied. The law was now involved, but they were playing into his hands, following a trail that led straight to Matthew's door. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Tiffany's yoga studio was tanking, its reputation in shambles. Class attendance plummeted by 60%, and online reviews painted a picture of unprofessionalism and questionable business practices. Investors were demanding meetings with lawyers, and the cracks in Tiffany's carefully constructed life were widening. "Her social circle is crumbling," Amanda reported, watching the fallout. 3 yoga studio investors have demanded emergency meetings. Their lawyers are reviewing all past transactions. Tiffany's empire is collapsing. But Shaun's most daring move was yet to come. As Matthew scrambled to salvage his criminal connections, a carefully planted file appeared on a seized laptop. The file contained evidence suggesting that Matthew had orchestrated the failed hit attempt to eliminate rivals within his own organization. "The Kovac found it," Ismail confirmed. "Their enforcers are mobilizing. Matthew's security team just quit. They won't go against the syndicate." The walls were closing in, and in his penthouse office, Matthew's desperation reached its breaking point. The SEC cameras showed him shredding documents, each frantic movement revealing more and more evidence planted by Shaun's team. "Sir," Marcus called over the comms. "Tiffany's approaching the building. She's demanding to see Matthew." Shaun watched the hidden surveillance feed in silence as Tiffany stormed into Matthew's office, her facade of composure crumbling. She didn't even notice the cameras capturing every word, every gesture. "You promised me everything was under control," Tiffany screamed, her voice breaking as her frustrations boiled over. "My accounts are frozen, my studio is failing, and my mother's giving evidence against me." Matthew's face was pale, his usual arrogance replaced by panic. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, his eyes darting around, searching for bugs, knowing they'd already found them. "This is just temporary," he muttered. "Once we deal with Shaun..." "Deal with him?" Tiffany's laugh was sharp, almost manic. "Face it, Matthew. You underestimated him. We both did." Matthew froze, his expression faltering for the first time. No one could have predicted he was MI6, he spat, the realization of their monumental error sinking in. Tiffany's voice rose again, incredulous. All this time, we thought we were playing a simple X-op, but we were actually taking on a trained operative? The revelation stunned Matthew into silence. For the first time in the entire ordeal, fear gripped him, and it was the most honest emotion he'd felt in a long time. Shaun's plan had worked, and Matthew was realizing, too late, that he'd been playing in a game far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Tiffany's voice trembled with panic as Matthew slumped in his chair, helpless in front of the burning realization. How did you find out? His voice was weak, filled with disbelief. It doesn't matter, Tiffany snapped, her hands trembling as she paced. What matters is we're finished. The restraining order was our last chance, and even that's backfiring. Somehow, he's turning everything against us. Shaun, watching the scene unfold on his screens, allowed himself a grim smile. The satisfaction was cold, methodical, and calculated. He had always known they'd overreach. "Initiate final phase," Shaun commanded, his tone as calm and authoritative as ever. "I want maximum pressure on all fronts. Don't leave them a single escape route." The operation entered its most dangerous stage. Sarah's cyber unit ramped up their digital onslaught, systematically dismantling Matthew's remaining business infrastructure. Their attacks were precise, targeting every weak spot they'd found in his digital empire, leaving no room for recovery. From false transactions to unauthorized withdrawals, it was clear that Matthew's financial network was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, Marcus's team was in motion, intercepting every attempt to move physical assets and ensuring no safe houses or secret accounts would provide refuge. Trina's intelligence operation fed new information both to law enforcement and to Matthew's former criminal allies, keeping the pressure unrelenting. "They're running out of options," Amanda observed, her voice tinged with anticipation. "The psychological pressure is breaking them. Matthew's on the verge of full breakdown, and Tiffany, she's cracking faster than expected." "Good." Shaun's voice remained unnervingly calm. "Now they'll understand what real fear feels like." The command center was alive with activity. Shaun's team moved with a precision that left no room for error. Every move was choreographed to tighten the noose, closing in on their targets from all directions. The air was thick with tension as they continued to monitor every aspect of the operation. Matthew's criminal connections, those he had once relied on, were now fully convinced he had betrayed them. They, too, had started to feel the sting of the chaos Shaun had expertly orchestrated. Tiffany's network of social allies was rapidly disintegrating. The lies she had woven around herself were unraveling fast as key members of her inner circle turned against her. The more they tried to fight back, the more fuel they poured into Shaun's fire. Amanda monitored the ever-growing list of failed attempts. "Their every move is a mistake. Each one only gives us more leverage." Shaun nodded, a cold, satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Good. Let them think they have some control. Let them struggle. Their panic will only make them slip further into the traps we've set." As the hours stretched on, Shaun's meticulous strategy was becoming painfully evident. Each of Matthew and Tiffany's desperate moves was countered with surgical precision. Financial transfers they tried to initiate were intercepted and redirected. Attempts to contact their allies exposed previously hidden connections they had hoped to keep secret. Every effort to flee or fight back ended in a dead end. They had underestimated him, and now Shaun was dismantling everything they had built, brick by brick. "I've been waiting for this," Shaun said quietly, watching the monitor display the mounting evidence linking Matthew to the failed hit attempt. Each leaked piece of information dug the knife deeper into his former allies. They too began to turn against him. "His empire is crumbling," Trina observed, her voice tinged with the thrill of victory. This isn't just business failure. It's public humiliation. The psychological warfare was working on an even deeper level than expected. Not only was Matthew losing control of his criminal underworld, but his own legitimacy. His last shred of respectability was falling apart in the eyes of his board members and investors. The screens in front of Shaun displayed the once confident and composed Matthew, now a shell of the man who had once called the shots. His movements were erratic as he scrambled to salvage anything he could cling to. Meanwhile, Tiffany was far from victorious. The bank refused her repeated attempts to access the frozen accounts. Her calls to Matthew went unanswered, her last lifeline slipping further from her reach. The restraining order, once her weapon, had become a symbol of her desperation. And in the streets, Ismail's informants had fed news of Tiffany's betrayal to local media, triggering a cascade of public backlash. The yoga studio's reputation, once a source of pride, was now tanking, with reviews pouring in about unprofessional behavior and accusations of fraud. "The yoga studio's reputation is in ruins," Trina reported, the satisfaction in her voice undeniable. "Class attendance is plummeting. Investors are scrambling for legal advice. It's a mess." Shaun allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Good. It's only a matter of time before their empire falls apart. The final phase of the plan took a darker turn when they planted evidence on a laptop Matthew had been attempting to hide. The file, discovered by his former allies, was damning, suggesting that Matthew had orchestrated the failed hit attempt, manipulating his own people for personal gain. "Perfect timing," Ismail confirmed, as the criminal factions turned on Matthew, now mobilizing with deadly intent. "He's lost control of even his most loyal soldiers. The Kovacs men are already on their way to handle it." In the penthouse, Matthew was in full panic mode. The destruction of critical documents only added to the chaos. He couldn't see the walls closing in on him, didn't know that each shred of paper he burned only fueled the flames of his downfall. Marcus's voice came through the comms, breaking the silence. "Tiffany's at the building. She's demanding to see him." The confrontation was inevitable. Tiffany stormed into Matthew's office, her composure now shattered. The hidden cameras captured the scene as her voice rose in fury. "You promised me everything was under control," Tiffany shouted, her face contorted with rage. "My accounts are frozen, my studio's failing, and now my own mother is giving evidence against me." "Keep your voice down," Matthew hissed, his panic now overtaking his usually calm demeanor. "This is just temporary. We just need to ride this out. Once we deal with Shaun—" "Deal with him?" Tiffany laughed bitterly. "Like your thugs dealt with him. Face it, Matthew, you underestimated him. We both did." Matthew paused, his eyes widening with dread. "No one could have predicted he was MI6, Tiffany's voice cracked. "All this time, we thought we were playing a simple ex-op, but we were actually taking on a trained operative." The confession hit like a thunderclap, leaving Matthew stunned. It was the first moment of true fear Shaun had seen on his face. Their world was unraveling, and the predator was finally revealing itself. Chapter 7: The Unraveling. Matthew Roberson's hands shook as he gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. Before him sat three of Chicago's most dangerous crime figures, their presence making the air in the room feel suffocating. He could feel the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him, each one now coming back to claim its price. Victor Kovac's scarred face, a testament to years spent in the underworld, remained impassive as he slid a stack of photos across the polished surface. The images were damning, each one capturing Matthew in compromising positions, meetings with rival crime organizations, and critical moments that lined up perfectly with the failed hit attempt on Shaun. "Explain this." Victor's voice was low, menacing. His eyes narrowed as they bore into Matthew's. Matthew's heart raced. His breath caught in his throat as he quickly scanned the photos. The pictures were undeniable, showing him in situations he had tried so hard to keep secret, but he couldn't let them see his fear. "These are forgeries," Matthew's voice cracked as he protested, the desperation clear. Someone's trying to frame me. Victor's lip curled slightly, showing no hint of sympathy. We found your signature on transfer documents. He cut him off. Money moving through shell companies, timed perfectly with attacks on our operations. You've been selling us out, Matthew. That's impossible. I never... Matthew stammered, but Victor wasn't done. Your own men confirmed it. The crime boss leaned forward, his words sharp. Before they disappeared. Matthew swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind racing. His empire was collapsing, his allies were turning against him, and there was nowhere to run. The cold realization gripped him like a vice. Back in the command center, Shaun watched the entire confrontation unfold on the monitors, the scene playing out with a perfect balance of anticipation and satisfaction. He hadn't just wanted to break Matthew, he wanted to watch as his target was slowly unraveled, piece by piece. How's our other target responding to the pressure? Shaun asked, his voice calm but tinged with dark amusement. Trina's fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up footage of Tiffany pacing her office. Her face was flushed with panic as she held her phone to her ear, her voice trembling. Karen, please, you have to help me. The studio needs this investment. Hello? Hello? Tiffany's words were desperate, her pleas growing increasingly frantic as each call ended in silence, another ally cutting ties. Tiffany's network is disintegrating exactly as planned, Amanda reported from her station, her voice steady as she reviewed the surveillance logs. The rumors about her criminal connections are spreading through their social circle. She's losing everything. Shaun's lips curled into a cold smile as he watched the collapse. His operation had entered its final phase, and each move, each piece of evidence, each whispered rumor was calculated for maximum impact. Tiffany was isolated, alone, and the net was closing in around her. Her yoga students are canceling memberships, Sarah reported, her tone impersonal as she monitored the data. Online reviews are mentioning possible fraud, questioning where their membership fees went. It's unraveling fast. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office, Matthew's world was crumbling just as quickly. The board of directors had called an emergency video conference, their faces grim as they delivered the devastating news. The SEC is investigating irregularities in our Asian subsidiaries, the board chairman said, his voice tight with concern. Furthermore, several major shareholders have expressed serious concerns about your recent behavior. I can explain, Matthew began, but the chairman interrupted him, his patience clearly worn thin. Save it for the authorities. As of this moment, you're suspended from all company operations. Matthew's eyes widened in shock, but he had no time to protest. His access card to the building no longer worked. His executive parking spot was reassigned. His assistant had resigned without warning. Everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. Sir, Marcus's voice interrupted the silence as the screens flashed. You need to see this. The screen showed Tiffany approaching an airport gate. She was stopped by security, the agent speaking to her with practiced authority. Ma'am, there are some irregularities with your passport. Please come with us. Shaun leaned back in his chair, watching with a sense of grim satisfaction. Tiffany's attempts to escape were doomed from the start. His planted evidence had triggered multiple flags in the immigration system. Now, she was caught. In the command center, Esther Bird and Amanda Garrett worked side by side, each compiling new pieces of damning evidence against Tiffany. Esther's hands trembled slightly as she slid a folder of bank records and personal documents across the desk. The country club staff confirmed it, Esther said, her voice tight with barely contained fury. She and Matthew used private rooms for their meetings, always paying in cash. I didn't raise her to be like this. Amanda nodded as she added to the growing dossier. 3 yoga instructors provided sworn statements about unauthorized charges to student accounts. The money trail leads directly to Matthew's shell companies. Shaun's strategy had been flawless. The criminal underworld's response had exceeded even his expectations. Matthew's former allies had turned on him with brutal efficiency. His private security detail had resigned, and his connections in the syndicates had evaporated. "Please," Matthew's voice cracked as he pleaded into his phone. "I need protection. They're coming after me." "You made your choice," a cold voice on the other end replied. "When you tried to play both sides. Now, deal with the consequences." Shaun watched, his gaze unblinking, as Matthew's world continued to collapse. He had been on top once, but now he was nothing more than a broken man, betrayed by everyone he had once trusted. Surveillance footage showed Matthew and Tiffany in a heated argument in his private garage. The tension was palpable as Tiffany screamed at him, her voice shrill with rage and fear. "You promised me protection," she shouted, her hands shaking. "Now my business is ruined. My reputation is destroyed, and the FBI is asking questions about student fees." "Keep your voice down," Matthew hissed, his eyes darting around the garage nervously. "This place might be bugged." Tiffany's laugh was bitter, laced with hysteria. "Like it matters now? Shaun's 10 steps ahead of us. He has been from the start." Matthew froze at the words, his expression turning pale. He was cornered. He had always underestimated Shaun, but now, as his empire fell apart, he realized the true magnitude of his mistake. Tiffany's fury turned into frantic pleading, but it was too late. Their fate had already been sealed. Their argument ended with Tiffany storming out, leaving Matthew alone with the wreckage of his crumbling empire. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the incessant buzzing of his phone. He couldn't bear to look at the screen, but each vibration brought another flood of messages that demanded immediate attention. Angry investors were demanding explanations, suspicious authorities were digging deeper, and former criminal partners were demanding answers that Matthew knew he couldn't provide. Each message felt like a nail in the coffin of everything he had built. In the studio's office, Tiffany faced her own reckoning. The confrontation with her senior yoga instructors had taken a turn she couldn't have predicted. They weren't just questioning her anymore. They were accusing her. The head instructor, usually a calm and measured woman, slammed a stack of documents onto the desk between them. "We found the real accounts," she said, her voice laced with disgust, "the ones showing where our pension contributions actually went." Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of her past mistakes pressing down on her chest. "I can explain," she began, but the instructor wasn't having any of it. "Save it for the labor board," the woman snapped. "They're very interested in hearing about this." The words stung, but they were nothing compared to the realization that her empire, the one she'd worked so hard to build, was falling apart in front of her eyes. The yoga studio, the sanctuary she had worked tirelessly to create, was now the source of her downfall. Meanwhile, Shaun's operation had grown beyond mere revenge. What had started as a personal vendetta had transformed into a meticulous campaign of justice. Every move, every piece of information he released wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was about dismantling everything Matthew and Tiffany had worked to build. Their current schemes, their web of lies, were being exposed, piece by piece, their entire foundation crumbling like a house of cards. "Matthew's legitimate businesses are filing for bankruptcy," Trina reported, her tone matter-of-fact. "Board members are cooperating with federal investigators." "And Tiffany?" Shaun asked, his voice calm but laced with satisfaction. "Completely isolated," Trina continued. "Her social media accounts are flooded with comments about fraud and betrayal. Former students are filing complaints with consumer protection agencies, and her yoga partners are distancing themselves." Shaun nodded, his gaze never leaving the screens in front of him. The psychological impact on his targets was evident. Matthew, once the polished CEO, had been reduced to a man desperately clinging to what little he had left. His carefully constructed persona of control and power was crumbling under the pressure of the mounting evidence against him. The suit and tie, the confident smile. It was all gone. Now, he was just another desperate soul trying to salvage whatever he could from the wreckage. Tiffany, too, was no longer the serene yoga instructor everyone once admired. Her calm exterior had cracked, and the weight of the allegations against her was becoming too much to bear. The emotional toll was apparent as she paced her office, her eyes wild with panic. She had been good at keeping her composure, but now the cracks were showing. Every phone call, every email, every piece of bad news pushed her closer to the edge. Sarah called out from her station, her voice tense. Matthew's trying to access his emergency funds. Shaun's lips curled into a grim smile. Let him, he commanded, his voice cold. The accounts are monitored. Each attempt provides more evidence for the authorities. It was becoming clear to Shaun just how far-reaching his operation had become. It wasn't just about Matthew and Tiffany anymore. It was about the world they had built. A world of lies, manipulation, and deceit, all coming crashing down around them. Their criminal contacts were disappearing, turning on them with ruthless efficiency. Their social circles were shrinking. The people who had once supported them were now turning their backs. It was a systematic unraveling, and Shaun was in complete control. In his secure room, surrounded by multiple screens, Shaun reviewed the day's developments with clinical precision. His revenge wasn't about the thrill of punishing those who had wronged him. It was about exposing the truth, the lies, the manipulations, the fraud. It was all being laid bare for the world to see. Each revelation, each new piece of evidence, stripped away another layer of their carefully constructed facades. It was a process of dismantling, and Shaun was the one pulling the strings. They thought they could manipulate the system, he said, his voice low and steady as he addressed his team. Now, the system will be their downfall. The footage on the screens showed his targets in increasing isolation. Matthew, once the kingpin of his empire, was now barred from his own company. His office door was locked, his access card was useless, and the place he once called home felt more like a prison. He was reduced to working from a hotel room, his phone ringing with calls from irate investors and law enforcement. His world had been upended in a matter of days. Tiffany, too, was facing a slow, agonizing collapse. The studio, once a thriving business, was now a ghost town. Legal notices stacked up on her desk, her inbox flooded with cancellation requests. Her reputation had been tarnished beyond repair, and no matter how much she tried to plead with former students and business partners, nothing could undo the damage. The whispers about fraud, about the misappropriation of funds, had spread like wildfire. Tiffany was completely alone now. No friends, no allies, just the weight of her crimes and the crushing sense of guilt that came with them. Shaun could see it all from his command center, their final descent into ruin. The operation was reaching its zenith. It had started as a personal mission, but now it was something far more significant. Their attempted murder plot against him had been their final mistake. They had crossed a line, and now they would learn what it truly meant to face the consequences. The unraveling had begun. Shaun's revenge would not be swift or merciful. It would be comprehensive, absolute, and most importantly, completely legal. His targets had chosen their path, believing they were clever manipulators who could outsmart anyone. But they hadn't counted on one thing. Shaun Jordan was a man who had spent his life dismantling operations far more sophisticated than theirs. Their downfall would not only be a punishment, it would serve as a case study in the consequences of betrayal, a lesson for anyone who thought they could play the system and get away with it. Shaun Jordan didn't just want revenge, he wanted to create a message, an example that would echo through Chicago's professional and criminal circles for years to come. His mission wasn't just about making them pay, it was about showing everyone else what happened when you tried to betray the wrong person. It was about restoring the balance, about making sure that the scales of justice were tipped back in his favor. As he watched the footage of his target's increasing isolation, A sense of satisfaction washed over him. The operation had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Matthew and Tiffany had underestimated him. They had thought they could manipulate the system, outsmart him, and escape the consequences. But now they were learning what it meant to face an opponent who had spent his entire life learning how to break systems, how to exploit weaknesses, and how to make the most powerful enemies pay. This was just the beginning. Shaun watched as the courtroom drama unfolded. Each twist and turn brought his adversaries closer to their inevitable downfall. He had built a meticulous case, leaving no room for escape. The relentless pressure was taking its toll on both Matthew and Tiffany, their defenses crumbling under the weight of their crimes. Tiffany sat motionless, her once pristine appearance now disheveled and worn. The weight of the allegations against her was suffocating. As the prosecutor presented more evidence of her involvement, her lawyer's attempts to shield her began to look increasingly futile. The air in the courtroom felt thick with tension, the walls closing in around her. Her thoughts raced, but there was no escape. Shaun's operation had left her no place to hide. Every connection, every attempt to cover her tracks had been exposed. The prosecutor's voice cut through her panic, detailing how she had used her yoga studio as a front for illicit operations, turning a place of healing into a hub for crime. She profited from human trafficking activities, the prosecutor continued, and was complicit in planning the attack on her husband. Tiffany's breath quickened. The memories of her cold, calculated decisions flashed before her eyes. She had once believed that she could control everything, manipulate the people around her, and walk away unscathed. But now those illusions were shattered. The news coverage painted a brutal picture of her fall from grace. The morning papers featured a damning photo of her hurrying through a back entrance to the courthouse, her face gaunt with fear. Reporters shouted questions at her as her lawyer shielded her from the cameras. The public had turned on her, and there was no way to repair the damage. "Your Honor," her lawyer stammered, "we ask for a reconsideration of the charges, given the circumstances." But the judge was unmoved. The evidence was irrefutable, and there would be no easy escape. The prosecutor continued, outlining Tiffany's role in orchestrating the scheme to attack Shaun, providing the final piece that linked her directly to the failed murder attempt. Her composure had long since evaporated. She could no longer maintain the facade of the perfect businesswoman, the poised yoga instructor. Now she was just a woman caught in a web of lies, unable to extricate herself from the mess she had created. The weight of her decisions was crushing, and she felt herself sinking further into despair. Meanwhile, Shaun's operation was moving forward with ruthless efficiency. His team had ensured that every piece of evidence had been meticulously prepared. Each document, each conversation, each transfer of funds had been documented and time-stamped. His strategy was not just about punishment, it was about exposing the truth, pulling back the veil that had allowed his enemies to thrive for so long. "Matthew's trial is scheduled for next week," Trina reported, looking over the latest updates. "The evidence against him is overwhelming. His network is falling apart, and no one is willing to stand by him." Shaun nodded, his expression unreadable. The plan was coming to fruition. Matthew's criminal associates had already started distancing themselves, eager to escape the fallout. Even those who had once supported him were now seeking to protect their own interests. "His associates are falling like dominoes," Trina continued. "Even his most loyal enforcers are turning on him." Shaun allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Matthew had thought he could play both sides. He had built a criminal empire on deceit, manipulating both legal and illegal markets. But now his world was collapsing around him, and Shaun had made sure there would be no escape. "The more they try to hide, the deeper they dig themselves into a hole," Shaun said coldly. "They'll never see it coming." Meanwhile, the media coverage of Matthew's arrest was gaining international attention. Headlines screamed about the extent of his criminal empire, detailing his connections to organized crime, human trafficking, and attempted murder. His former colleagues, once proud to be associated with him, were now distancing themselves, scrambling to save their own reputations. Matthew's assets are being seized as we speak, Marcus reported. We've locked down everything. His offshore accounts, his corporate holdings, even his personal property. He's effectively broke. Shaun leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen displaying Matthew's mugshot. The once pristine image of the confident, powerful businessman was now replaced by a disheveled, frightened man in prison orange. Shaun felt no sympathy. This was the man who had betrayed him, tried to have him killed, and who had built his life on lies. Tiffany, too, was feeling the weight of her actions. As the charges against her mounted, her lawyer struggled to present a coherent defense. The evidence was overwhelming. Her direct involvement in Matthew's operations, her role in laundering money, and her participation in the conspiracy to kill Shaun. Every move she made was being watched. Every phone call tapped. Every account frozen. "She's finished," Amanda said, watching the coverage unfold. "There's no way out for her." Shaun's eyes narrowed. He had seen how people like Matthew and Tiffany operated, smooth, manipulative, ruthless. But now they were learning what it meant to face someone who had spent years dismantling operations far more sophisticated than theirs. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. "The people who thought they could exploit the system," Shaun said quietly, "are learning what happens when they push too far. No one gets away with betrayal." The next phase of the operation was already in motion. Shaun's charitable foundation, built with the money recovered from their illicit activities, was set to launch. It would be a symbol of justice, of taking back what had been stolen and using it to protect those who had been victimized. The irony of using their ill-gotten gains to fund programs for domestic abuse victims and corporate fraud protection was not lost on anyone in the operation. "Public sentiment is entirely on your side," Amanda reported. "Social media is buzzing with support for you. People are calling for harsher penalties for both of them." Shaun watched as the situation escalated. Matthew's public image was destroyed, Tiffany's reputation obliterated. There would be no coming back from this. Their empire had crumbled, and the consequences of their actions were unfolding before them. "They thought they could destroy me," Shaun said, his voice calm yet deadly. "Now they're the ones being destroyed." As the final phase of Operation Clean Slate unfolded, Shaun knew that this was more than just revenge. It was about making an example of those who thought they could manipulate others without consequences. Matthew and Tiffany would learn the hard way that their betrayals would not go unpunished. Their empire was gone. In his holding cell, Matthew finally grasped the full scope of Shaun's revenge. Every criminal contact he tried to reach had been compromised. Every escape route had been blocked. Every contingency plan had been anticipated and countered. Tiffany, facing her own imprisonment, realized too late the magnitude of her miscalculation. The evidence Shaun had gathered wouldn't just send her to prison. It would ensure she remained under AED surveillance long after her release. The criminal underworld had received the message. "Your handling of this situation has earned their respect and their fear," a report noted. Shaun watched the screens displaying his target's downfall. His revenge hadn't just destroyed their current lives, it had eliminated any possibility of them rebuilding their power. They thought they could manipulate the system, he told his team. Instead, the system became their prison. The operation's success exceeded even Shaun's expectations. Matthew and Tiffany hadn't just been defeated, they had been systematically dismantled, their crimes exposed, their reputations destroyed, their futures erased. Operation Clean Slate has lived up to its name, Shaun reflected. I've demonstrated why betrayal carries such a heavy price. This lesson will resonate through Chicago's power circles for years to come. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months after Operation Clean Slate, Shaun stood before a group of MI6 recruits in a secure training facility. The dimly lit room was lined with monitors, each displaying images and videos from Shaun's personal operation, now converted into a training curriculum. He had transitioned from a man bent on revenge to a respected strategist, his methods refined and repurposed to guide the next generation of operatives. Threat assessment isn't just about identifying enemies, he began, his voice steady and commanding. It's about understanding how personal connections can become vulnerabilities, and how to turn those vulnerabilities into advantages. He clicked the remote, and footage from his dismantling of Matthew and Tiffany's empire filled the screen. Each phase showcased the meticulous planning that had gone into exposing the fraud, human trafficking, and other crimes they had committed. Sir, a recruit raised her hand. How did you maintain operational security while managing multiple cover identities? Shaun smiled slightly, leaning forward. By understanding that every role, even a cover, must be grounded in truth, he replied. The security consultant wasn't just a facade. It became a legitimate business. We built something solid to protect the operations from the inside. The recruits nodded in understanding, their attention fixed on him as they absorbed the lesson. After the session, Garrett approached, a file in her hand, her expression one of quiet approval. I-6 leadership is impressed with your new training program, she said, her tone measured but appreciative. They're suggesting we expand it into a full consultancy division, private sector. Shaun considered the offer for a moment. More flexibility, fewer restrictions, he countered. Agreed. I'll handle the paperwork. The decision was swift, a natural next step in his evolution from operative to mentor, from revenge-driven justice to creator of solutions. The Jordan security consultancy launched with minimal fanfare but quickly gained a reputation for handling complex threats. Within weeks, high-profile clients, many drawn by Shaun's own name and history, sought their services. Another request from a Fortune 500 CEO, Trina reported, her voice steady but efficient. His wife's involved with a suspected corporate espionage ring. Shaun raised an eyebrow, the familiarity of the situation not lost on him. Sounds familiar, he noted dryly. Bring in Amanda for the psychological assessment. We'll need insight into the family dynamic. His sister, Amanda, had proven invaluable in developing client profiles. Her deep understanding of human behavior, combined with Shaun's tactical acumen, had created a unique approach to threat management. The partnership between them was more than just business. It was personal redemption. Each case they tackled together was a reaffirmation of their shared commitment to ensuring that no one else would suffer the way they had. The Foundation's first project launches next month, Amanda added, her voice softer now but full of purpose. A support network for victims of domestic fraud and corporate exploitation, funded by Matthew's seized assets. Adds a certain poetic justice. Shaun couldn't help but smile at the irony. The stolen money from Matthew and Tiffany's illegal operations would now be used to support those who had suffered in similar ways, turning their greed and betrayal into a means of healing for others. The Jordan Foundation, a cause he could stand behind, was a project born from the ashes of his own pain, something that could help those who had been victimized by the very systems of deceit and manipulation that Matthew and Tiffany had once championed. Meanwhile, in the women's federal prison, Tiffany's life had been irrevocably altered. No longer the poised yoga instructor with a carefully crafted image, she now wore the drab prison uniform, her world reduced to counseling sessions and monotonous routines. The prison counselor, an experienced professional who had seen many come and go, observed her with a practiced gaze. "Tell me about your choices," the counselor prompted, her voice gentle but probing. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had once been a woman of privilege, her life a series of carefully curated decisions designed to keep up appearances. But now that world was gone. Her shoulders slumped as she recalled her past actions. "I thought I was so clever," Tiffany replied, her voice strained, "playing the victim, manipulating public opinion. I never realized Shaun was 10 steps ahead, documenting everything. The weight of her realization hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had thought she could outsmart him, but Shaun had been far more calculated, far more prepared than she had ever imagined. Across the country in witness protection, Matthew faced a new kind of prison, one that was invisible but no less suffocating. His cooperation with the authorities had led to the takedown of multiple criminal syndicates, but it had come at a steep cost. He was no longer the powerful man he had once been. His connections, his empire, his very identity, all of it had been erased. Another syndicate boss, arrested in Chicago, his handler informed him, his voice monotone. Your testimony was crucial, but remember, you can never go back. Matthew nodded, the gravity of his new life settling into his bones. Exile was the price of his freedom, a life spent constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that one wrong move could cost him everything. Meanwhile, Shaun's security firm had grown exponentially. As their reputation spread, they began to attract top-tier talent. Trina Gillespie, now the chief of operations, brought her CIA experience to their expanding client base, providing invaluable insights into international threats. We've got requests from 3 continents, she reported during their morning briefing. Word spreading about how we handled the Robertson case. Looks like our name's becoming synonymous with success in crisis management. Shaun leaned back in his chair, the satisfaction of their accomplishments settling into his chest. His team was more than just a group of professionals. It was a family, bound together by a shared commitment to precision and integrity. Isma Holmes, now heading their intelligence division, had transformed his street-level contacts into a sophisticated network that provided actionable information on potential threats. Our preventive threat assessment program is showing results, he noted proudly. 2 potential situations neutralized before they escalated. People are beginning to take us seriously. The success of the consultancy was not just a reflection of Shaun's skills, but of the lessons he had learned through his own suffering. Each victory was a testament to his growth, not just as a strategist, but as a man who had chosen to rise above the betrayal and destruction he had endured. One evening, over dinner, Amanda looked at her brother with a thoughtful expression. You're different now, she observed. Stronger, but not harder. You've turned this experience into something positive. Shaun met her gaze, the corners of his mouth lifting into a small smile. The best revenge isn't just destruction, he replied quietly. It's creation. Building something meaningful from the ashes. The community that had once shunned him now sought his guidance. Former friends who had believed Tiffany's lies approached with apologies and business proposals, hoping to rebuild bridges that had been burned in the past. Mr. Jordan, a prominent banker requested, his voice nervous but eager. We'd like to discuss upgrading our executive protection protocols. Your handling of the Robertson situation impressed our board. Shaun considered the offer for a moment. Of course, he replied, his tone professional but with a subtle edge of finality. They had come to him because they recognized the value of his experience, but Shaun had learned that true power came not from wealth or influence. It came from control over one's own destiny. Shaun's new dating life reflected his evolved perspective. He was no longer interested in the superficial. Catherine Maxwell, a corporate attorney he had been seeing for several months, was different. She understood the complexities of his world and respected the boundaries he had set for himself. I appreciate your honesty about your work, Catherine said one evening, her gaze steady as she looked at him across the dinner table. Not many men in your position would be so direct. Shaun chuckled softly, the bitterness of his past fading with each passing day. Deception has a price, he replied. I've seen it collected. As his team's reputation grew with each successful operation, so did Shaun's sense of purpose. They specialized in cases that required his unique combination of intelligence, tradecraft, and personal insight. Cases that, for all their complexity, had one thing in common. They needed a strategist who understood the depths of human betrayal and the power of turning pain into something positive. Another client saved from corporate infiltration, Trina reported, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The perpetrators never saw us coming. Shaun nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to the screen that displayed their latest success. He had come a long way since that first day of seeking vengeance, and now he was doing something far more meaningful. His story wasn't just about the destruction of Matthew and Tiffany. It was about transformation. It was where division stopped, turning the lessons of the past into a force for good. And that, he knew, was the true victory. Shaun had always been a man defined by his ability to analyze, to predict, and to act decisively. His life had been built on an intimate understanding of human weakness, an understanding he had refined during his personal vendetta against Matthew and Tiffany. But now, with his enemies neutralized, his skills had taken on new meaning. His command center, once the nerve center of vengeance, had evolved into a bustling headquarters for the Jordan security consultancy. No longer was it filled with the hum of surveillance systems documenting betrayal. Now, it buzzed with the energy of professionals working to prevent threats before they materialized. Each file that came across his desk now represented a potential disaster that could be avoided, a tragedy that could be prevented. "What's next?" Trina asked, her voice filled with the quiet confidence she'd earned over years of navigating the complex world of intelligence and security. She'd become more than just a colleague to Shaun. Over the course of their work together, she'd become someone he trusted implicitly, someone who understood the gravity of each decision they made. Shaun studied the latest reports from their global network of operatives, each detailing potential threats that had been diffused before they escalated. The consultancy had grown exponentially, attracting top talent from various intelligence agencies. From the outside, they were a premier security consultancy firm, but to those who knew the full story, they were a new breed of operative, one that fused professional security with an almost personal level of understanding about the nature of betrayal and human fragility. "These is just the beginning," Shaun said quietly. "We're more than just a security firm. We're in the business of saving lives by understanding the deep emotional currents that lead people to make dangerous choices." Trina nodded, her gaze flickering to the team of analysts at their stations. Each one of them had come to understand that it wasn't just about tracking down threats or patching vulnerabilities. It was about understanding the psychology behind every risk. It was about understanding the psychology behind every risk. Oh, that's what makes us different. We don't just neutralize threats. We prevent them from becoming something more dangerous. Shaun's reflection on his work was interrupted by a soft ping from his secure phone. It was a message from Amanda. "We need to talk." Shaun had always maintained a professional distance from the personal, but Amanda had become integral to his success. She was a psychological profiler with an understanding of human motivations that perfectly complemented Shaun's tactical expertise. Over the years, she'd become not just his sister, but his closest ally, a woman whose insight helped him navigate the emotional labyrinth that betrayal had thrown him into. The text was short, but Shaun knew that when Amanda reached out like this, it usually meant something was about to shift in a significant way. That evening, over dinner at one of the restaurants that had once been a favorite haunt of the city's elite, they discussed the next phase of Shaun's work. Amanda watched him carefully, noticing the subtle shifts in his demeanor. He had become a different man since their days of dealing with Matthew and Tiffany. He was still the sharp, calculated operator, but now there was a layer of humanity he'd long kept buried. "You've changed," Amanda said finally, breaking the silence. Shaun looked up, meeting her gaze across the table. "I had to," he replied. The old Shaun was focused on destruction. I wanted to tear them down, punish them for what they did to me. But I've learned that true power doesn't come from vengeance. It comes from rebuilding. Amanda smiled softly. She had always been the emotional anchor in their family, and Shaun had rarely opened up to her in the past. But in the wake of everything that had happened, he had come to realize that the only way to truly move forward was to stop living in the shadow of his past. "You're right," Amanda agreed, her voice steady. "It's not about tearing things apart. It's about using your skills to prevent the same thing from happening to others." Shaun nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had turned the devastating betrayal of Matthew and Tiffany into a force for good, creating a company that not only protected high-profile clients, but helped individuals and businesses avoid the pitfalls he had fallen into. The Jordan Security Consultancy had become more than just a business. It was his redemption, and in many ways, his legacy. Meanwhile, in the prison, Tiffany was serving her sentence, but the transformation that Shaun had gone through was reflected in the lives of those she had hurt. No longer a wealthy socialite with a carefully curated public image, Tiffany had been stripped of her former life, reduced to facing the consequences of her actions. Counseling sessions became her only outlet. Her once polished exterior had been replaced by the unvarnished truth. No more distractions, no more pretending. And it was during one of these mandatory sessions that Tiffany finally came face to face with the full weight of her betrayal. "I thought I had it all figured out," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I could manipulate everything. But Shaun, he was always 10 steps ahead. I never even saw it coming." Her counselor nodded, understanding the nature of Tiffany's awakening. "What did you learn?" Tiffany wiped away a tear. That it wasn't about being clever or controlling the narrative. It was about using other people, destroying their trust, ruining their lives. "I destroyed myself in the process." The counselor gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod. "We can't change the past, but we can learn from it." Matthew, on the other hand, faced a different kind of reckoning. His cooperation with the authorities had earned him a kind of safety, living in witness protection under a new identity. But it had also sentenced him to a life of isolation. His past was now a ghost that followed him, and no amount of freedom could erase the knowledge that he was forever severed from everything he had known. "I gave them everything," Matthew muttered, looking out the small window of his new, government-protected home. "I gave them names, connections, everything I had. But it doesn't matter. I lost everything, my wealth, my status, my identity." His handler's voice came through the intercom, cold and businesslike. "That's the price of survival. You helped put away dangerous people, Matthew. That's all that matters now. Move forward." But Matthew knew that he could never move forward. His life was one of constant vigilance, living in fear that the past would catch up with him, that someone would recognize him for who he truly was. Shaun's new life was about balance. The revenge that had consumed him for so long had led him to this point, but it was no longer his driving force. His consultancy flourished, bringing in a steady stream of clients from all corners of the globe. The work was rewarding, more fulfilling than any operation he had ever undertaken. And in his personal life, Shaun was finally starting to find peace. His relationship with Catherine, his corporate attorney partner, grew with each passing day. Their connection was built on mutual understanding. She saw past his dark past and recognized the man he had become, not just a survivor, but a creator, someone who built empires from the ashes of destruction. "Deception has a price," Shaun had said once, and now, standing at the helm of a thriving business, he realized that he had not just paid that price, he had made sure others wouldn't have to. Shaun Jordan had come a long way from the man who had once been consumed by revenge. His past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. The man who had dismantled empires had now become the one who protected them. In the end, Shaun understood something that had eluded him for so long. The greatest form of strength lies not in what you destroy, but in what you create. His legacy would not be written in the ruins of his enemy's downfall, but in the lives he saved, the clients he protected, and the lessons he passed on. Shaun Jordan had gone from seeking retribution to shaping a future where betrayal and pain no longer had the power to define his world. Epilogue. A decade had passed since the tumultuous days of Shaun's personal war, when betrayal had once nearly consumed him. Yet, here he was, standing at the pinnacle of his career, with his life's work unfolding before him, both professionally and personally. The room in London was filled with the world's best in security, intelligence, and crisis management. But Shaun had long since learned that the true power lay not in defense, but in understanding the people behind the threat. His team had perfected a model that focused on prevention over reaction, dismantling potential disasters before they even had the chance to spark. As Shaun concluded his speech at the conference, the applause resonated through the hall. There was no longer a doubt in anyone's mind. The Jordan Security Consultancy was a leader in its field. He stepped away from the podium and caught Catherine's eye in the front row. She smiled at him, a quiet gesture of support and understanding. Their marriage had withstood the complexities of their lives, a union founded on trust and forged in the fire of shared experience. Catherine had proven to be not just his partner in life, but a pillar in their success. Her legal expertise and ability to navigate the murky waters of corporate law made her indispensable. 10 years, Shaun said to her softly as they shared a moment before the crowd. Feels like another lifetime. Catherine's hand found his, her touch grounding him. But look at everything you've built, what you've done. You turned everything that could have destroyed you into something meaningful. Shaun nodded, his gaze drifting across the room, watching his team interacting with the guests. Trina, now CEO of the consultancy, exuded an air of authority and grace as she managed the growing global operations. Her sharp instincts had transformed what was once a modest security firm into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Trina's handling the new initiatives perfectly, Shaun said. I couldn't ask for a better partner in the business. And she has your full trust, Catherine added, her smile both proud and knowing. You built a team that could weather anything, because they trust you, and they trust each other. Their partnership had extended beyond family. Trina, Ismail, Amanda, and even Garrett. All of them had become an extension of Shaun's family, each one shaping the consultancy into something greater than the sum of its parts. Back in their high-rise office in Chicago, the consultancy had evolved. They no longer just responded to immediate threats. Their new global approach, spearheaded by Ismail's network of intelligence contacts across Asia and Trina's strategic oversight, focused on proactively eliminating risks before they became full-blown crises. Their work had become global. A client in Hong Kong, a corporation in Mumbai, or a government figure in Dubai, they all now turned to Jordan Security for protection. They were no longer just offering a service. They were safeguarding entire industries, countries, and families. As Shaun walked back toward his team after the conference, he felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. The pain of betrayal had been replaced by the satisfaction of what they had built together. His team had helped him heal, helped him evolve, from the man on the run, seeking revenge, into the one who now gave others the power to protect and defend. But no matter how far he had come, he would never forget the lessons that had shaped him. Trust was the most fragile thing in the world, and betrayal was always just a step away. He could never lower his guard completely, but he could use the power of his experience to prevent others from experiencing the same kind of devastation. At dinner later that evening, with Catherine by his side and their team gathered around the table, Shaun took a deep breath. The future seemed as uncertain as ever, but for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He had built something that would endure, a legacy that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with protection. You've come a long way, Shaun, Garrett said, a rare compliment slipping from his lips as he raised a glass. You turned your greatest trial into your greatest triumph. Shaun looked at his team, his family, and then back to Catherine. "We all did," he replied. "Together we built something that matters." As they clinked glasses in quiet celebration, Shaun allowed himself one moment of reflection. He had lost much along the way: trust, love, and faith. But he had gained something far more valuable: resilience, clarity, and an unshakable sense of purpose. And as he watched his team continue to rise, he knew one thing for certain: betrayal would always come, but it could never break him. Not now, not anymore. "She still leads yoga classes for inmates," a prison counselor reported, her voice tinged with both observation and resignation. "But the arrogance is gone. Your revenge succeeded beyond mere punishment. It forced her to confront her true nature." Shaun Jordan listened closely, the words carrying a weight he hadn't expected to feel. He'd known that his ex-wife Tiffany would pay for her role in betraying him, but hearing the full extent of her downfall reminded him of the complexity of vengeance. The journey had been long and brutal, but the resolution had, in its own way, served a greater purpose. Tiffany was no longer the woman who believed she could manipulate and control everything around her. Now, she was just another convict, the truth of her actions and her consequences forever intertwined. Shaun's mind shifted to Matthew Roberson. His fate had taken a different route, but it was no less tormenting. The system had granted him protection, but it was a hollow gift. Witness protection, meant to give criminals a second chance at life, had failed to give Matthew the fresh start he'd imagined. Instead, Matthew lived in a perpetual state of fear, always looking over his shoulder, paranoid of the next shadow creeping up behind him. Shaun had thought about the man often, wondering if Matthew ever realized how deeply the betrayal he'd caused had affected not just Shaun's life, but his own. Matthew's testimony dismantled several criminal organizations, reported Ismail, his voice calm but steady. His cooperation was crucial, but the price he's paid is a life filled with constant fear. He's working as a retail manager now in Idaho. No friends, no relationships, no connections. He's a ghost. Shaun wasn't surprised by this development. It was the price Matthew paid for betraying not just Shaun, but his entire world. The criminal underworld had been shaken by the revelations in the Roberson case, and Shaun's meticulous planning had turned Matthew's life into a cautionary tale. Word spread through the underworld like wildfire. Some targets, no matter how tempting, were better left alone. Shaun had proven that a person's betrayal could bring about not just their downfall, but an irreversible unraveling of everything they once knew. While Matthew and Tiffany's fate was sealed in their respective worlds, Shaun found himself reflecting on other aspects of the journey, those that had endured and, in a sense, transcended the darkness of the past. Max, their loyal golden retriever, had been more than just a pet. Max had been a companion, a symbol of loyalty in a world that had, for a time, felt devoid of it. 2 years after the operation, Max had passed away, but his legacy lived on in a different form. The Jordan Security Consultancy had established a canine training program in his honor, one that not only trained exceptional security dogs for physical threats, but also specialized in identifying emotional signals. The dogs had an uncanny ability to detect anxiety, fear, and distress, qualities that were vital in situations where a person's emotional state could reveal a deeper vulnerability. Max's spirit, his unwavering loyalty, had been translated into a force for good, helping others feel safe in a world that often seemed hostile and untrustworthy. Nate Little, one of the operation's most valuable allies, had gone through his own process of transformation. Initially, Nate had been skeptical of Shaun's methods, but after a series of tense operations, his loyalty had been proven beyond any doubt. Over time, Nate's investigative skills had become invaluable, And though he was semi-retired, he occasionally consulted on particularly challenging cases. Their bond, once strained, had been rebuilt over years of shared understanding. "You taught me to trust my instincts," Nate said to Shaun during a rare meeting between the two. "That case showed me how to look beyond surface appearances. There's always more beneath the surface, and sometimes it's not the obvious threat that's the most dangerous." Shaun nodded, appreciating the depth of Nate's understanding. They had both come a long way since that first operation, and their relationship had transformed from one of skepticism to mutual respect. Nate had grown into a seasoned investigator, one who understood that every situation, no matter how trivial it might seem, could harbor a hidden danger. Esserbird, too, had found her purpose in the aftermath of the operation. Her daughter's tragic choices had broken her, but it had also inspired her to help others facing the same kind of devastating betrayal. Esser had joined the Jordan Foundation, where she worked tirelessly with families, especially parents, who were dealing with children on destructive paths. Her support groups became sanctuaries for those struggling to understand the betrayal of a loved one. "I couldn't save my daughter from her choices," Esser said during one of their support group meetings. "But I can help others recognize the warning signs. I can help them intervene before it's too late." Her words resonated deeply with those who attended the group sessions. Esser's pain had been transformed into purpose, her efforts helping countless families save themselves from the heartbreak she had endured. The yoga studio that had once been a place where Tiffany had weaved her lies and manipulated others had become a symbol of transformation itself. Under the leadership of the Jordan Foundation, it had been repurposed into their primary counseling center. The very space where deception and betrayal had been planted now offered solace, healing, and understanding to those who had suffered similar betrayals. The foundation had become a beacon of hope, guiding people through the tumultuous aftermath of personal and professional devastation. Dr. Dennis Johnston, Shaun's former physician, had joined the Foundation's advisory board, bringing his medical expertise to the cause. His work was groundbreaking, focusing not only on the mental and emotional scars left by betrayal, but also on the physical effects that often accompanied them. Through his collaboration with the Foundation, new programs were developed that helped individuals process and heal from the stress and trauma caused by betrayal, offering both psychological and physical care to those in need. "Your case changed how we approach patient care," Dr. Johnston commented during a checkup with Shaun. "We now understand that personal security threats don't just affect the mind. They manifest in the body as well. The stress of betrayal can lead to a range of physical ailments. And we're finally acknowledging that." Shaun had never imagined that his journey through betrayal would lead to such a far-reaching impact. Every aspect of his life, from the creation of the Jordan Security Consultancy to the growth of the Jordan Foundation, was built upon the ashes of what had once been a devastating personal betrayal. What had started as an attempt to destroy those who had wronged him had evolved into something much larger, something far more meaningful. Joan Kelly, the observant neighbor who had first seen through Tiffany's facade, had become a key figure in the consultancy's Neighborhood Watch program. Joan's keen eye for detail had helped Shaun and his team uncover crucial information in their early investigations. And now, her vigilance was being put to use in a broader, more community-oriented context. Her work had become a vital part of the consultancy's preventative efforts, teaching people to spot the signs of deceit and manipulation before they could escalate. Shaun's revenge, though thorough and precise, had never been about punishing his enemies in the traditional sense. It had been about changing the game entirely, using the betrayal as a catalyst for something better. The Jordan Security Consultancy stood as a testament to this new approach, an organization that not only thwarted threats, but also created lasting systems to protect others from falling victim to similar fates. Shaun's story had become something far more profound than just a tale of revenge. It was a story of transformation, how one man's personal trauma had inspired a revolution in professional security, and how that transformation had rippled outward, protecting others from the same kind of pain he had endured. With every new challenge, Shaun faced the future with the confidence that, no matter the difficulty, he had already turned his darkest moments into opportunities for growth, change, and lasting impact. And so with that, our journey together concludes. The aftermath of betrayal, pain, and loss turned into transformation, healing, and innovation. What started as a tale of vengeance ended up creating a ripple of change, a lasting legacy. Shaun's story proved that while betrayal can break someone, it can also give rise to something greater. If you've enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Share what resonated with you or how this story impacted you. If you'd like to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and click on the video you see on the screen for more exciting tales. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned for the next adventure.